The platform between two worlds, Hailwick, was the kind of town people passed through before they understood it was worth staying for. Its railway station sat between two low hills and a row of soot-darkened shops, old enough to have watched generations leave with suitcases and return with children of their own. Emily Watson knew every crack in its tiled floor, every complaint of its aging pipes, every regular passenger by the rhythm of their footsteps. She was not rich, not powerful, and not the sort of woman anyone in London would look at twice. But on platform 3, with the wind rising in the evening, trains delayed, her small world was about to collide with one built from money, secrets, and decisions made far above her head. She would not know at first that the injured stranger she found in the storm had once been able to shift markets with a signature. She would only see a man who had nothing left but fear in his eyes. By 6 in the evening, rain had turned Hailwick Station silver. It slid down the glass canopy in restless streams, gathered along the rusted edges, and dropped in uneven beats onto the platform below. The old station clock, round-faced and stubborn, ticked above the concourse as if it personally disapproved of delays. Emily stood beneath it with a clipboard pressed to her chest, listening to the announcement system crackle before giving up halfway through another apology. Typical, Arthur Bell muttered from the ticket office doorway. One storm and the whole Northern Line behaves like it's been personally betrayed. Emily smiled without looking up. To be fair, Arthur, this station behaves like that on clear days. He gave her the look he reserved for employees. He secretly liked too much to scold. Arthur had managed Hailwick Station for nearly 30 years, long enough that even the pigeons seemed to respect him. He had a white moustache, a bad knee, and a gift for making rules sound like moral principles. Platform 3 needs checking before the 1842 crawls in, he said. Signal's been temperamental again. I'll go, take a torch, and don't argue. I never argue, Arthur snorted. You negotiate with the truth. That made her laugh softly. It was the kind of laugh she allowed herself at work. Brief, useful, not asking for anything. Emily had learned early that asking too much of life could become dangerous. Her father used to say dignity was a coat you wore from the inside. No one could steal it unless you let them. He had said it when the landlord raised the rent, when her mother's medication cost more than expected, when he came home with coal dust in the lines of his hands and still polished his boots for Sunday. He had also said it the year before he died, standing right on platform 3, watching Emily in her first uniform. Remember, he had told her, adjusting the collar she had been too nervous to fix herself. There's no shame in honest work, only in looking down on it. She had carried those words for 9 years. They had become a sort of private foundation beneath all the practical pieces of her life. Morning tea before sunrise, careful budgeting, extra shifts during holiday seasons, a tin of emergency cash hidden behind recipe books in the kitchen. Her life was not glamorous, but it was steady. She knew how to mend a hem, calm an angry commuter, change a fuse, and smile when someone mistook kindness for weakness. Outside, the wind shoved at the station doors hard enough to rattle the glass. Emily pulled on her navy coat and wound a red scarf around her neck. The scarf had once belonged to her mother, who now spent most evenings under a blanket by the electric heater, pretending not to worry about bills. Emily had offered to work fewer late shifts after the last bout of flu, but her mother had simply patted her hand and said, "Don't make your world smaller because mine has become a room." So Emily kept working, kept moving, kept Hailwick Station, running in the small ways no executive report would ever measure. The irony, though she did not yet know it, was that somewhere in London, people in polished shoes were measuring the station in exactly those cold terms: passenger volume, maintenance costs, redevelopment potential, a red line on a spreadsheet, a property opportunity. A place like Hailwick could be erased with the tidy click of a pen. But on that evening, Emily's concerns were more immediate. The leaking canopy above platform 3, the flickering lamp near the far bench, and the old signal relay that had been coughing errors into Arthur's logbook all week. She stepped through the side door and into the weather. The cold struck first, sharp against her cheeks. Rain speckled her lashes. Platform 3 stretched ahead beneath a weak row of lights, its yellow safety line shining like wet paint. Beyond the tracks, the fields were dark, interrupted only by the occasional sweep of distant headlights from the road. Platform 3 inspection, she said into her radio. I'll check the far end and signal cabinet. Arthur's voice crackled back. Mind your footing, yes, Dad, she murmured, then froze for half a second because she had not meant to say it. There were habits grief left behind like furniture in a locked room. You forgot they were there until you walked into them. Emily breathed out, watching the air mist pale before her, and continued down the platform. At first she noticed only ordinary things. A newspaper had been plastered flat against a bench by rain. Someone had left a paper cup rolling near the bins. The poster advertising discount day returns to York had peeled at one corner again. She made mental notes automatically because that was what her job required and, more honestly, because noticing small things made the world feel manageable. Then she saw the shoe. It was black leather, expensive looking even under a smear of mud, lying half beneath the last bench near the unlit stretch beyond the canopy. For a moment, Emily simply stared. Lost property was common enough, but not like that, not one shoe alone, not with rainwater running around it in thin, nervous lines. Her fingers tightened around the torch. Arthur, she said into the radio, slower now. There's something at the far end. I'm checking. What sort of something? I'm not sure. The wind carried away part of his reply. Emily moved forward, torch beam cutting through rain. The platform narrowed near the maintenance gate, where Ivy had begun climbing the brick wall despite Arthur's campaigns against it. She swept the light, left, right, then down. A man lay in the shadow beside the bench. For one suspended second, the station seemed to empty of sound. The rain still fell, the wires still hummed, the distant signal still glowed red through the mist. But Emily heard only the heavy thud of her own heart. He was curled slightly on his side, one arm folded beneath him at an awkward angle. His dark coat was soaked through, the collar torn, his white shirt marked with dirt and something darker near his temple. He wore only one shoe. His hair, black and rain-flattened, clung to his forehead. Even unconscious, there was something unmistakably out of place about him. Not just the quality of the clothes, but the absence of belonging. He looked as if he had fallen out of another life and landed badly in hers. Emily dropped to her knees beside him. "Sir, can you hear me?" No response. She set the torch down so the beam angled across his face. He was perhaps in his 30s, with features too composed to be called soft even in injury. Strong brow, straight nose, a mouth pressed into a line of pain. There was a bruise darkening along his jaw. Rainwater gathered at his lashes. Emily touched 2 fingers to the side of his neck. A pulse beat there, unsteady but real. Relief hit her so hard, she almost scolded him for it. "Arthur, I need help on platform 3. Male, injured, unconscious or semi-conscious." The radio spat, static. "Arthur?" Nothing but a broken hiss. Emily looked back toward the station building. The rain had thickened into a moving curtain. Of course the radio would choose now to fail. She pulled her phone from her coat pocket, but the screen showed one thin bar flickering in and out. "Brilliant," she whispered. The man moved. It was small at first, a twitch of his hand against the wet concrete. Then his breathing changed, roughening. His eyes opened suddenly, unfocused and wild. Emily leaned closer but kept her voice low. She had dealt with drunk passengers, panicked teenagers, elderly travelers confused by platform changes. Fear was fear, whether wrapped in designer wool or a school blazer. "You're safe," she said. You're at Halewick Station. My name is Emily, you've been hurt. His eyes moved to her face, but there was no recognition in them, only terror, raw and bewildered. He tried to push himself up. No, don't move. Emily placed a hand lightly on his shoulder. You may have a head injury. He flinched at her touch, then grimaced as pain caught up with him. His gaze darted past her toward the tracks, the bridge, the darkness beyond. Where his voice was hoarse, almost scraped out of him. Where am I? Halewick. Northern Line, you're at the station. His brow tightened. He looked as if he were trying to read words written behind his own eyes and finding only blank paper. I don't. He swallowed hard. I don't know this place. That's all right. Help is coming. She said it with more confidence than she felt. Her thumb tapped her phone screen again. No signal. She cursed internally with the restraint of someone raised to be polite even in emergencies. What's your name? She asked. He stared at her. The question seemed to frighten him more than the blood at his temple. My name, he repeated. Yes, can you tell me? His lips parted. Nothing came. Rain fell between them in bright strands. Emily saw his hand curl against the concrete, nails scraping slightly as if he could physically hold himself together. I. His breath shook. Richard. Richard, good. That's good. She nodded, grounding him with the certainty she lent. Passengers during delays. Do you have a surname, Richard? He closed his eyes. For a moment she thought he might pass out again. Then he opened them, and the emptiness there made something inside her ache. I don't know. Emily went still. There was a particular vulnerability in those 4 words that no amount of expensive tailoring could hide. People misplaced tickets, keys, luggage. They did not misplace themselves. Not without something terrible happening first. All right, she said gently. Just Richard for now. His gaze fixed on her scarf, perhaps because it was the only warm color. In the storm, did I? Was there someone with me? I don't know, I just found you. He looked down at himself with dawning horror, patting clumsily at his coat pockets. Emily understood and helped, checking with professional care. No wallet, no phone, no watch. The pale strip on his wrist suggested there had been one recently. Emily's unease deepened. A man in a costly coat did not end up injured on platform 3 without identifications, unless he had lost more than his memory. Either he had been robbed, or someone had wanted him to disappear, or both. The thought moved through her like a draft under a door. We need to get you inside, she said. You're freezing. At that, he caught her wrist, not hard, but with sudden desperation. No police. Emily looked at his hand, then at his face. His fingers were cold, trembling. His fear did not feel criminal. It felt hunted. Richard, you're injured. I have to call someone. No police, he repeated, weaker now. Please. The word landed differently than she expected. Men like him, at least men dressed like him, did not usually say please as if it cost them pride. This man did, or maybe whatever life he had come from had been stripped away so completely that pride no longer mattered. Emily thought of Arthur waiting in the ticket office, probably trying to fix the radio. By glaring at it, she thought of her father's voice. Dignity is a coat you wear from the inside. She thought of the stranger before her, soaked and shaking, wearing no dignity except the fragile remains of being alive. I'm going to get medical help, she said. That doesn't mean I'll let anyone mistreat you. His eyes searched hers with painful intensity, as if trust were a language he had forgotten but still desperately needed translated. A distant rumble passed through the rails. Emily turned sharply. The delayed 1842 was approaching, still far off but coming. A train on wet tracks, a confused injured man near the platform edge, and no working radio. Her body moved before thought finished forming. Richard, listen to me. We have to move away from the edge. He tried to obey. That made it worse. His first attempt to rise failed. His knees buckled, and he sucked in a breath through clenched teeth. Emily slid an arm behind his back, bracing more weight than she expected. He was tall, solid, and shaking with cold. For one absurd instant, She wondered who he had been before this platform. Someone important, perhaps. Someone unaccustomed to leaning on anyone. Now he leaned on her, because there was no one else. "Easy," she said. "One step, that's it." They made it as far as the bench. He collapsed, eyes unfocused again. Emily shrugged off her coat and draped it around his shoulders, ignoring how instantly the rain bit through her uniform. He looked at the coat as though no one had ever given him warmth without asking his name first. "You'll be cold," he murmured. "I work here. Being cold is practically in the contract." A faint, confused crease touched his brow. It might have become a smile in another life. The train roared past without stopping, delayed express carriages flashing gold-lit windows through the rain. For several seconds, the world became noise and wind. Emily stood between Richard and the platform edge, one hand on the bench back, her scarf whipping against her cheek. Through the blur of windows she glimpsed faces, passengers warm inside, looking down at phones, unaware that a man with no memory sat only yards away from their passing lives. When the train vanished into the dark, silence rushed back in its wake. Richard's head dipped. "No, stay with me." Emily crouched before him. "Richard, look at me." His eyes opened with effort. "I need to call an ambulance. Do you understand?" Something in his expression changed at the word ambulance. Fear returned, sharper, cutting through the fog. He reached inside the coat, as if searching again for an object that was gone. His hand found nothing. His breathing quickened. "They'll know," he whispered. "Who will know?" He stared past her shoulder into the rain-darkened station, and for a heartbeat Emily felt the strange, crawling sensation that they were not alone. She turned, scanning the platform. Empty, only the flickering lamp, the discarded shoe, the shine of wet rails. When she looked back, Richard had gone grey beneath the bruising. Emily made her decision. Whatever mystery clung to him, whatever trouble had followed him to Hailwick, he was hurt and she was the one who had found him. There were rules for that. And there were deeper rules too. The ones her father had taught without writing them down. You did not measure a person's worth before helping them. You did not ask whether someone deserved saving while they bled in the rain. She stood and lifted her phone high, moving toward the small pocket of reception near the signal cabinet. One bar appeared, vanished, then returned. She pressed emergency call before the signal could change its mind. "Emergency services. Which service do you require?" "Ambulance," Emily said quickly, turning back toward him. "Possibly police as well. I'm at Hailwick railway station, platform 3. I've found an injured man, mid-30s, head wound, confused, possible memory loss." A hand closed around her sleeve. Not forcefully, desperately. Emily looked down. Richard had slid from the bench to one knee, as if the last of his strength had been spent, crossing the small distance between them. His fingers gripped the navy fabric of her uniform. Rain ran down his face, but his eyes were clear for one terrible second, filled with a fear so human that it made every difference between them vanish. "Don't," his voice broke. Emily covered the phone slightly, kneeling beside him. "Richard?" He tried to focus on her, tried to hold on to consciousness, to the platform, perhaps to the only person in the world who knew him by any name at all. "Don't let them find me," he whispered. Then his fingers loosened from her sleeve. His body sagged forward, and Emily caught him just before he hit the ground. By the time the ambulance lights swept over platform 3, the rain had turned the whole station silver. Emily stayed on her knees with Richard's weight against her, one arm braced around his shoulders, her uniform soaked through at the sleeves. His head rested heavily near her collarbone, his breathing uneven but present. That, she told herself, was enough. Breathing meant there was still time. Breathing meant the platform had not stolen him away before anyone learned who he was. Arthur Bell arrived first, coat thrown over his pajamas, boots unlaced, face stern in the way only truly frightened men tried to look stern. Emily. His voice softened the instant he saw them. "Good Lord," he collapsed, she said, though the words felt useless. Everything important had already happened in the way. Richard's fingers had clung to her sleeve, in the terror behind his final whisper. "Don't let them find me." Arthur knelt on his other side, checking Richard with the clumsy care of a man who had handled broken signals, frozen points, and drunken passengers, but never a stranger who seemed to have fallen out of another life. "Ambulance is coming," Emily said. "Polis too." At that, Richard stirred faintly, his lashes flickered, a groan broke from him, and his hand moved blindly, searching. Emily caught it without thinking. His fingers closed around hers. Arthur noticed. His eyes shifted once from Richard's face to Emily's, but he said nothing. The ambulance crew rushed in, moments later, bringing warmth, authority, and the sharp smell of antiseptic into the lonely platform. They asked questions Emily could barely answer. "Name Richard," she said. "Surname? I don't know. Age? Mid-30s perhaps." Where had he come from? She looked down the tracks, into the dark mouth beyond the signal lights. "I don't know that either." When the paramedics lifted him onto the stretcher, Richard's grip tightened suddenly around her hand. His eyes opened, unfocused, panicked. A police officer leaned closer, asking his name, asking if he could hear him, asking where he lived. Richard's breathing quickened. His face changed in a way Emily would remember later with a strange ache. Not confusion, exactly, but dread, as though names and addresses were not facts to be recovered but traps waiting to close. "It's all right," Emily told him, walking beside the stretcher until the platform edge forced her to stop. "You're safe, I'm here." Perhaps he heard only her voice. Perhaps he did not understand the words, but his fingers held hers until the ambulance doors opened. And when they finally had to separate, he looked at her as if she were the last lit window in a town swallowed by fog. The clinic in Halwick sat behind the old churchyard, small and practical, with pale yellow walls and radiators that clanked too loudly in winter. Emily had been there for flu jabs, a sprained ankle, and once at 16, after fainting from working too many shifts and eating too little. She had never noticed how helpless people looked beneath hospital blankets until she saw Richard lying under one. Without the rain on his face and blood at his temple, he looked less like a man found half lost on a platform and more like someone misladen from a world with better lighting. His features were sharp but exhausted. His hands, resting above the blanket, were long-fingered, unmarked by manual labor. Not soft exactly, but unused to the kind of work that cracked skin in the cold. The police searched his coat pockets and found nothing useful. No wallet, no phone, no keys, no ticket. A torn lining, a damp handkerchief, and a watch with a cracked face that had stopped at 8:17. "Could have been robbed," one officer said. "Or could be hiding something," murmured the other. Emily heard it from the doorway and disliked him immediately. Dr. Ellis, who had known Emily since she wore pigtails and followed her father through the station, explained the situation in careful tones. Head trauma, concussion, temporary amnesia was possible. He might regain memory quickly, or in fragments or not for some time. He should be monitored overnight. "And he said nothing else?" the officer asked Emily. "Before he lost consciousness." Emily's fingers tightened around the paper cup of clinic tea. She remembered the whisper, the fear, the sleeve under his hand. "Don't let them find me." She looked through the glass panel at Richard, pale against the pillow. If someone was looking for him, shouldn't the police know? That was the sensible answer, the safe answer. Arthur would have said facts mattered, procedure mattered. But when the officer had asked Richard for details, his pulse had spiked so badly, the nurse had told everyone to step back. He was confused, Emily said at last, mostly incoherent. It was not quite a lie, it was not quite the truth. It sat between them, heavy and warm, like a sleeping animal. The officer studied her for a second. Emily lifted her chin, not defiantly, but steadily. She had learned long ago that people with pressed uniforms often mistook kindness for weakness. Working at a small station taught you otherwise. You could be polite and immovable at the same time. "We'll circulate a description," he said. "If he remembers anything, contact us." When Richard woke properly near dawn, Emily was still sitting in the chair beside his bed. She had meant to go home. Several times, in fact. Arthur had told her to rest. Mrs. Whitby had called the clinic and scolded her through the reception phone. Even Dr. Ellis had said, "Emily, he is stable. You are not a medical device." But each time she stood, Richard's brow tightened in sleep, and that absurd, tender sense of responsibility pulled her back down. His eyes opened slowly. For a moment he stared at the ceiling, then at the pale curtain, then at the machines beside him. Panic entered his face quietly, like water rising under a door. Emily leaned forward. "You're in Halwick Clinic. You had a head injury. You're safe." His gaze found her. Something in him eased. It was so immediate, so unguarded, that Emily felt embarrassed, as if she had seen him reach for her in a room full of strangers. "You stayed," he said. His voice was rough and deeper than she expected. "Yes." "Why?" She almost smiled. "You collapsed on my platform. It felt rude to abandon you afterward." He blinked, as though humor was a language he used to know but had misplaced with everything else. Then, very faintly, his mouth softened. "What's your name?" "Emily Watson." He repeated it under his breath. "Emily, and you're Richard, at least that's what you told me last night." His expression changed, searching inward. The effort pained him. "Richard," he said slowly. "Is that all?" "For now." The doctor came in soon after, followed by questions. Richard could not answer. Surname, silence, date of birth. His jaw tightened. Address, his hands curled into the blanket. Occupation. A flash of something crossed his face, then, not memory, but pressure, as if a vast shape moved behind fog and frightened him by its size. "I don't know," he said. The words cost him more than they should have. Emily saw it. A man like him, whoever he was, had been accustomed to answers. Not having them seemed to humiliate him. When the police returned later that morning, his distress grew worse. His voice stayed calm, but Emily watched the color drain from his face, watched his fingers tremble once before he hid them under the blanket. "We just need to establish who you are," the officer said. Richard looked toward Emily, not pleading this time, anchoring. She stepped closer before she had decided to move. "He's concussed," Dr. Ellis said. "Too much pressure isn't helpful." The officer sighed. "Miss Watson, he can't invent a life because you're impatient." There was a small silence. Richard looked down, but Emily saw the faintest curve at one corner of his mouth. After they left, he spoke without looking at her. "You shouldn't have done that." "Probably not. Why did you?" She considered giving him something light. "Because policemen annoy me before breakfast. Because you looked as if you might bolt through a second-floor window. Because last night you held my sleeve like the whole world was hunting you." "Instead," she said, "because frightened people shouldn't be cornered." His gaze lifted to hers then. It was too intense for a clinic room with plastic chairs and a vending machine humming beyond the door. "I'm not frightened." Emily glanced at his hand gripping the blanket. He followed her gaze, released it, and looked almost offended by his own body. "All right," he said quietly. "Perhaps I am. By afternoon." Practical problems arrived, as they always did, stepping over emotional revelations with muddy boots. The clinic could keep him one more night, perhaps two, but no longer. Without identification, without money, without anyone to collect him, Richard existed in a gap no form quite knew how to fill. Arthur came by with a paper bag of clothes from the station lost property. A jumper, dark trousers, a coat that smelled faintly of someone else's aftershave. He stood at the end of the bed, arms folded. "We can't have unknown men wandering about Halwick," he said. Richard, sitting up now, looked at him with tired dignity. "I don't intend to wander." "No? What do you intend?" A pause. Richard looked away. "I don't know." The simple honesty took some of the iron out of Arthur's face. Emily, who had spent her lunch break making 3 phone calls and receiving 2 refusals, said, "Mrs. Whitby has a room above the bakery. Small but warm," she said. "He can stay a few days if Dr. Ellis agrees." Arthur frowned. "Margaret said that?" she said. "If the poor man is a murderer, at least he'll have to get past my rolling pin." Richard stared. Emily smiled despite herself. "That means yes." The first evening outside the clinic, Halwick received Richard the way small towns received anything unfamiliar, openly, suspiciously, and with biscuits. Whitby's bakery stood across from the station, its windows fogged with heat, its shelves golden with loaves, buns, and iced cakes that made even grief smell survivable. Mrs. Whitby herself was round, silver-haired, and fierce-eyed, wearing a flour-dusted apron like armor. "So this is our mystery, gentlemen," she said, looking Richard up and down. "You look thinner than a scandal and twice as troublesome." Richard, unused to being assessed like bread dough, inclined his head. "Thank you for allowing me to stay." "Oh, listen to that," she said to Emily. "Manners. Dangerous in a handsome man." Emily felt heat rise to her cheeks and busied herself with the paper bag of food she had brought. Soup in a flask, bread, apples, and tea bags because clinic tea should not be anyone's first memory of civilization. The room above the bakery was modest but clean. A narrow bed, a small table, a wardrobe with one stubborn door, a wash basin beneath the window. From there, Richard could see the station clock, its face glowing softly over platform 3. He stood by the window for a long time. Emily set the food on the table. "You don't have to remember everything tonight." He gave a faint laugh, but there was no humor in it. "You say that as if memory is a misplaced umbrella. In Halwick, we take umbrellas very seriously." This time his laugh was real, brief, and surprised. It changed his face. For 1 second the haunted stranger disappeared, and Emily saw a glimpse of someone younger beneath the exhaustion. Then he tried to make tea. It should not have been moving. It was only a kettle, a mug, a spoon, a tea bag. Yet he studied the objects with such grave concentration that Emily had to turn toward the window to hide her smile. "You've done this before, surely," she said. "I assume so, you assume. I understand the theory of tea." He looked at the kettle, then at her. "Water, heat leaves, time." Emily pressed her lips together. "That is both correct and deeply upsetting." He overfilled the kettle, nearly forgot to switch it on, and put the milk in, first with the uncertainty of a man defusing a bomb. When the tea was finally made, it was too pale, but he offered it to her with quiet seriousness. She accepted it. No one had prepared any for him at the station the night before, procedures, stretchers, questions. Now, in a room smelling faintly of sugar and yeast, he stood with borrowed clothes and no past, waiting to see if she would approve his first small act in this new life. "It's good," Emily said. He saw through her instantly. "It's terrible." "Yes," admitted, "but kindly meant." His expression stilled at that kindly meant, as if the phrase had reached some place memory could not. Over the next day, Halwick began its debate over Richard. Mrs. Whitby fed him. Arthur watched him. No Price from the signal room asked too many questions and offered to check missing person forums. The postman decided Richard had London bones, whatever that meant. 2 elderly women from the morning train whispered that Emily had found herself a tragic prince, and Emily nearly dropped a tray of ticket stubs into the bin. Richard heard some of it. She could tell because he grew quieter when people looked too long. He tried to help in the bakery and broke a stack of cake boxes by folding them inside out. He offered to carry flour sacks and nearly toppled backward under the first one. He stood at the till with the grave terror of a man facing international negotiations when a child asked for 2 iced fingers and gingerbread sheep. Yet he kept trying. That was what undid Emily most. Not his bruised temple, not his lost name, not even the way his eyes followed her whenever the station bell rang and she had to leave. It was his refusal to surrender to helplessness, though helplessness plainly humiliated him. It was the way he apologized to Mrs. Whitby after every mistake until she snapped, "One more sorry and I'll charge you rent in guilt." That evening, Emily brought him shepherd's pie from her own kitchen, wrapped in foil and still warm under her coat. She told herself it was because Mrs. Whitby closed early on Wednesdays, because he needed proper food, because anyone recovering from concussion should not live on buns and dignity. Richard opened the door before she knocked twice. "You knew it was me?" she asked. "I heard your step on the stairs." A strange answer. Stranger still, it pleased her. They ate by the small table, while rain tapped gently at the window, softer than the storm that had brought him here. Below them, Mrs. Whitby sang tunelessly while cleaning trays. Across the street, the station clock marked each minute with patient authority. Richard looked that place. "The station? It matters to you." Emily followed his gaze. Platform 3 lay quiet under yellow lamps, ordinary, unimpressive. "Dear as a heartbeat. My dad worked there," she said. "Arthur trained under him. I grew up thinking railway timetables were bedtime stories. Was he kind?" The question was simple, but Emily felt it settle deep. "Yes," she said. "Tired, mostly, but kind." Richard nodded as if this mattered, as if kindness were not decoration but architecture. After a while, he said, "When I woke in the clinic, I remembered nothing. Not my surname, not where I belonged, but I remembered your voice." Emily looked at him. He seemed embarrassed by the confession, but he did not take it back. "I don't know what that means," he continued. "Perhaps nothing. Perhaps the brain clings to whatever is nearest." "Perhaps," Emily said, though her own voice had gone softer than she intended. "But when the police asked me questions, everything felt." He paused, searching for words in the dark, cold, like doors closing. "Then you spoke, and I could breathe." Outside, a train passed without stopping, its windows flashing briefly like fragments of another life. Emily sat very still, hands wrapped around a mug of tea he had made slightly better than yesterday. She should have told him not to trust her too much. She was only a station worker, not a nurse, not family, not a promise. Her life was held together by shifts, bills, and the stubborn pride of not needing anyone more than necessary. "Instead," she said, "then, for now, when doors close, you can knock here." His eyes met hers. There were moments that did not declare themselves loudly. They entered quietly and changed the furniture of the heart before anyone noticed. Later, Emily would wonder if this had been one of them. The warm room, the rain, the man with no past looking at her as if she had given him not charity, but ground beneath his feet. Downstairs, Mrs. Whitby called up that she was turning off the shop television, and did anyone want the last custard tart? Emily stood quickly, grateful for the interruption. "I should go." Richard rose too fast, winced, and had to grip the table. "Careful," she scolded. "I'm fine. You are concussed, homeless, and defeated by tea." His mouth curved. "Temporarily defeated. That's the spirit." She left him with half the pie, 2 apples, and strict instructions not to reorganize Mrs. Whitby's shelves, no matter what system he believed they lacked. At the bottom of the stairs, Mrs. Whitby had the small television on after all, volume low, flickering blue across the darkened bakery. Emily paused to help gather cups, one eye on the screen only long enough to see a serious-looking news presenter beneath the banner. "Financier missing after London meeting." "Nothing but rich people losing themselves these days," Mrs. Whitby muttered, reaching for the remote. Emily, tired and thinking of Richard upstairs, alone by the station clock, took the remote from her gently. "Let's not fill the room with bad news." As she changed the channel, the screen flashed for one brief second with a blurred CCTV image of a man in a dark coat, head turned away, walking through a London terminal. The presenter's voice slipped under the click of the remote. "Billionaire financier Richard Morgan remains missing tonight. Then the image vanished into the bright colors of a cooking program, and Emily did not see the face that the rest of the country was being asked to find. By morning, the bad news Emily had refused to let into the bakery seemed to have stayed politely outside, pressed behind the steamed-up windows with the early frost. Hailwick woke slowly, the way small railway towns did in winter. First came the milk van rattling over the cobbles, then the smell of yeast and butter rising from Mrs. Whitby's ovens, then the distant groan of the 612 freight passing beyond the hill like some old iron animal clearing its throat. Emily arrived at the station with her scarf tucked under her chin, her breath white in the blue-grey air, and found Richard already standing on platform 3. He was looking up at the station clock, not in the blank, frightened way he had looked at it the first night, when he did not know his own name and the whole world had narrowed to the ache in his skull. This morning his gaze was quieter, almost respectful, as though the clock had become a witness between them, keeping account of every small hour he had survived. "You're early," Emily said. Richard turned. He was wearing the spare navy jumper. Arthur Bell had lent him, the sleeves a little short at the wrist, and an old station jacket with one button that refused to fasten. On anyone else, it would have looked shabby. On Richard, with his straight shoulders and composed face, it looked almost deliberate, like some expensive designer's idea of ordinary life. "I thought if I was going to ask for work, I shouldn't arrive after the trains." Emily lifted an eyebrow. "That sounds dangerously sensible." A faint smile touched his mouth. "I do occasionally surprise myself." She tried not to smile too much, because smiling too much around Richard had become a risk. It softened her before she was ready to be softened. It made her forget that he was still a stranger, with no surname, no history, and no promise that one day he would not simply remember everything and disappear. Arthur Bell was in the ticket office, polishing his glasses with the severity of a man preparing to say no. He had run Hailwick Station for 32 years and believed strongly in rules, timetables, and people not becoming emotionally attached to problems that had not yet filled in the proper paperwork. "No," Arthur said before Emily had fully finished explaining. Richard stood beside her, hands folded in front of him, accepting the refusal with the calm of someone accustomed to being judged. Emily leaned her elbow on the counter. "Mr. Bell, we're short-handed." "We are always short-handed. It builds character. The benches on platform 2 need repairing. The west side gutter is loose. Mrs. Patel nearly tripped over that cracked board by the waiting room yesterday." Arthur looked at Richard over his glasses. "Can you repair a bench?" Richard paused for half a second too long. Emily closed her eyes briefly. "I can learn," he said. Arthur gave a sound that might have been a laugh if it had possessed more optimism. "Can you carry luggage without looking as though you're apologizing to it?" "I can attempt that as well." "And can you refrain from alarming passengers with philosophical conversations about lost identity?" Richard's face remained solemn, but Emily saw the corner of his mouth betray him. "I'll do my best." Arthur looked between them then, in the way of kind men who disliked appearing kind. He sighed as if the entire collapse of British rail standards had landed personally on his desk. Temporary, cash in hand from the maintenance fund. No machinery, no ticket systems, no climbing ladders if you break anything. "Miss Watson will explain to me why I listened to her." Emily beamed. Gladly, Richard looked at her then, and for one brief unguarded moment, gratitude moved across his face so clearly that she had to look away. Work did not suit him at first, not because he lacked willingness. If anything, he possessed too much of it, applied with such careful seriousness that even tying a stack of old notices for recycling became a matter of grave attention. He carried a suitcase for a visiting lecturer and held it so far from his body that the man asked, politely, whether there was something wrong with it. He misjudged the weight of a trunk belonging to an elderly woman and staggered half a step before recovering his balance with wounded dignity. He picked up a screwdriver as if it might require negotiation. No Price, who maintained the station's ancient electrical systems, with headphones around his neck and permanent grease on his fingers, watched Richard kneel before a broken bench. You ever used one of those before? Richard glanced at the screwdriver. In theory, I've flown a helicopter. Emily, passing with a clipboard, shot No a warning look, but Richard only nodded. Then perhaps we should both avoid airports. No blinked, then laughed despite himself. By mid-morning, the platform had accepted Richard in the cautious way Halwick accepted all new things, first by staring, then by testing, then by pretending it had never cared. Mrs. Whitby sent over a paper bag of warm currant buns. The postman asked if the lost gentleman could help lift a crate. 2 schoolchildren on their way to Leeds waved at Richard after he retrieved a dropped mitten from the edge of the platform, and he stood there with the mitten in hand, looking startled by their easy trust. Emily noticed things. She noticed how he always stepped aside first, as if he had been trained never to block a path. She noticed how he listened to instructions once and remembered them perfectly, though he still tightened screws too hard and frowned at rust as if personally offended by it. She noticed that when passengers complained, he did not become defensive. He became still, watchful, measuring the room, the voices, the problem beneath the noise. And she noticed, most of all, the loneliness. It lived in the spaces after he laughed, in the careful pause before answering questions about himself, in the way he looked at families greeting one another from trains, his expression softening and closing at the same time. Like a man standing outside a lit house, remembering warmth, but not knowing whether he had ever been invited in at noon, Emily found him in the waiting room, trying to repair the loose armrest of a wooden bench. A smear of dust marked his cheek. His hair had fallen forward slightly, making him look younger and less untouchable. "You're holding the bracket upside down," she said. He looked at the bracket, then at the bench, then back at her. I was beginning to suspect the bench had a difficult personality. Emily crouched beside him and turned the metal piece around. Their hands brushed. It was a small accident, barely a second, but the cold from outside seemed to fall away around them. "There," she said too quietly. "Try now." He tightened the screw, this time correctly. The armrest held. A strange satisfaction crossed his face. Not triumph, not pride in the grand sense. Something humbler, almost bewildered. "I fixed it," he said. "You fixed part of it. Let me have the moment, Emily." She laughed and his eyes lifted to hers. There it was again. That feeling she kept trying to fold away neatly and place somewhere safe. Richard had arrived in her life broken open by mystery, and yet every day he seemed to reveal some part of himself that was not broken at all. Gentle manners, dry humor, an instinctive courtesy that felt old-fashioned without being false, and beneath it, some kind of pain held so tightly that she wondered who had taught him to suffer silently. The afternoon brought chaos. At 2:17, just as rain began tapping against the glass roof, the ticketing system failed. It was not a graceful failure. The screens froze, the card readers refused payment. The printer in the ticket office produced 3 inches of nonsense before dying with a mournful beep, and a queue formed so quickly it seemed to reproduce by magic. A delayed connection to Manchester made everyone anxious. A businessman in a grey coat announced loudly that this was unacceptable. A mother with 2 children looked close to tears. Arthur's face darkened to the colour of storm clouds. "No," Emily called. Already on it came Noah's voice from behind the office door, followed by the sound of something being unplugged with unnecessary violence. The queue thickened. People pressed toward the counter, waving phones, rail cards, complaints. Emily moved between them with practiced calm, but even she could feel the order beginning to fray. Halwick Station was small. It survived on rhythm. When the rhythm broke, everything became human noise. Then Richard stepped forward, not loudly, not dramatically. He simply moved to the side of the queue, took in the departures board. The crowd, the handwritten delay note Arthur had slapped against the glass, and the narrow entrance causing half the congestion. "Emily," he said, low enough that only she heard. "Which passengers need the 2:34 connection?" She pointed quickly. "Manchester through Leeds, platform 1 in 12 minutes. And local tickets can be bought on board if the guard agrees, but people panic." Richard nodded once. Something in him changed. It was so subtle that Emily nearly missed it. The uncertain man who had asked how to hold a screwdriver disappeared. His posture settled, his gaze sharpened. He did not become arrogant exactly, but he became certain in a way that made people instinctively listen. "Ladies and gentlemen," he called, his voice clear but calm. "We can get everyone moving faster if we separate the queue. Manchester connections to the left by the timetable board, local travel to the right near the heater. Anyone paying cash, please have it ready. Anyone with a pre-booked reference, hold your phone screen open. We'll write temporary authorizations for urgent connections first." The businessman objected, of course. "And who are you supposed to be?" Richard turned to him with a politeness so cool it could have chilled tea. "At the moment, the person preventing you from missing your train." A few people laughed, the tension cracked. Emily stared at him. Arthur stared too, then recovered and barked. "You heard the man. Move with purpose, not panic." Within 2 minutes, the queue had split. Within 5, Emily and Arthur were issuing handwritten notes with carbon paper from a drawer that had not been opened since 1998. Richard directed passengers with astonishing ease, remembering destinations after hearing them once, calming the mother by placing her near the front, asking a teenage boy to help an elderly man with his bag, sending the businessman to platform 1 with exactly 30 seconds to spare. No emerged from the office, hair ruffled, holding a cable like a defeated snake. "Systems coming back." "It can wait," Arthur muttered, watching Richard guide the last few passengers through. "This is better than the blasted system." When the platform finally emptied, the rain had softened into mist. The station seemed to exhale. Emily stood behind the ticket counter, hands braced on the wood, heart beating strangely hard. Richard turned back to her, the certainty draining from him as though he had only borrowed it. "Was that all right?" She almost laughed at the absurdity of the question. "All right?" she said. "Richard, you just reorganized half the county with a broken printer and Arthur's emergency carbon slips." His expression flickered. It felt familiar. The words landed gently, but Emily felt the weight beneath them. Familiar. A door somewhere inside him had opened a fraction, just enough to let cold air through. "Do you remember something?" He looked past her to the rain-glossed tracks. For a moment she thought he might answer yes. Then his brow tightened, frustration and fear passing through his eyes. "No, not a picture. More like knowing where pressure will break if no one redirects it." He gave a faint, helpless smile. "That sounds strange," Emily said. "It sounds useful." He was quiet for a long moment. Then he said, almost to himself, "useful." It was only one word, but Emily heard something in it that made her chest ache. That evening, after the last commuter train had carried away its tired faces and yellow windows, they sat on a bench. Richard had helped repair, drinking tea from paper cups Mrs. Whitby had sent over. The platform lamps glowed in soft circles. Somewhere down the line, a child waved from a departing train, and Richard lifted his hand in return. He watched the train disappear. "I used to think," he said slowly, "or perhaps that being important meant people moved because of you." Emily wrapped both hands around her cup. "And now I think," he searched for the words. "Today no one knew who I was. No one had to flatter me. No one had to fear me. But that woman caught her connection. The bench won't collapse under Mr. Bell. A child got her mitten back, his voice softened. Being useful without being powerful may be the first peaceful thing I have ever done. Emily looked at him then, really looked, and felt the dangerous tenderness in her grow roots. She wanted to ask what kind of life had made peace unfamiliar to him. She wanted to know who had stood around him, who had demanded from him, who had loved him badly or not at all. But she only leaned her shoulder lightly against his, because some questions were doors, and some doors should not be forced open in the dark. For a while, neither of them spoke. The station clock ticked above platform 3. The town settled into evening. Richard sat beside her in Arthur's too-short jumper, smelling faintly of rain, dust and tea, and Emily allowed herself one foolish, quiet thought. If no one came for him, perhaps he could stay. The thought had barely formed before headlights swept across the station forecourt, not the soft yellow lamps of a taxi or the muddy beams of a farmer's van. These lights were white and sharp, gliding over wet stone with expensive silence. Emily turned her head as a black car drew up outside the entrance, sleek and polished, absurdly out of place beside the peeling station sign and the bicycle rack. The engine stopped. A woman stepped out. She wore a dark tailored coat, high heels unsuited to Halewick's uneven pavement, and leather gloves that looked as though they had never touched anything unclean. Even from a distance, Emily could see the confidence in the way she moved, the effortless claim she made upon whatever ground she crossed. Richard stiffened beside her. Emily felt it before she understood it, the sudden stillness in him, the cup stopping halfway to his mouth, the air changing. The woman approached the open station door and spoke to Arthur, who had just emerged with the cash box tucked under one arm. "Excuse me," she said, her accent smooth, expensive, and London cold. "I'm looking for a man who may have arrived here recently. Tall, dark-haired, early 30s, possibly injured. He may not be using his real name." Arthur's gaze shifted, just once, toward platform 3. Emily's fingers tightened around her paper cup. The woman reached into her handbag and drew out a photograph. "Have you seen him?" she asked for one thin second. Emily had the absurd feeling that the photograph in the woman's gloved hand might burn through the cold air and leave a mark on all of them. Arthur did not take it immediately. He stood in the doorway of Halewick Station with the cash box under his arm, his cap slightly crooked after the morning rush, his weathered face giving nothing away. Around him, the station carried on pretending to be ordinary. A pigeon hopped along the gutter. Somewhere behind the ticket office, the kettle clicked off. On platform 2, Mr. Dale coughed into his scarf while waiting for the late train to Leeds. But Emily knew ordinary had already cracked. The woman held the photograph higher. It was Richard. Not exactly the Richard who had spent 3 nights above Mrs. Whitby's bakery, learning how to use the old electric heater without tripping the fuse. Not the man who had helped Arthur stack replacement timetables and had apologized twice when he smudged ink on his sleeve. This photograph showed him in a black evening suit, sharp and unreachable, with one hand tucked into his trouser pocket and the faintest impatience in his eyes. A man who belonged to glass towers, private rooms and silent cars. Not to platform 3. Emily's heart struck once against her ribs. Arthur's eyes moved back to the woman. "A lot of men pass through this station. Not like him," she said. Her voice did not rise, yet something in it made the ticket hall feel smaller. Emily had heard that tone before from passengers who believed a uniform meant obedience. This woman wore command more naturally than her coat. Arthur took the photograph at last and looked at it with admirable dullness. "Can't say I know him." Emily lowered her paper cup and stepped slightly closer to Richard, blocking the view from the door with her body. Richard had gone very pale. The warmth that Mrs. Whitby's tea had put into him seemed to drain from his face in an instant. "Emily," he whispered. His hand was pressed to his temple. She turned her head just enough to see him. "Don't move, I know that voice." The words came through clenched teeth, as if dragged out of some locked room in his mind. His eyes were fixed beyond her shoulder, not on the woman's face, shape, on the woman's face, as though her presence had shape, weight, danger. You remember her? Emily asked softly. No, his breath hitched. I don't know. It hurts. Emily made her decision before she understood it. She set her cup on the bench, caught his sleeve, and pulled him back toward the narrow passage beside the parcels office. Richard stumbled once but followed. She pushed open the door to the old signal room, the one Arthur used mostly for archived logs and parts that might be useful one day, and guided him inside. The air smelled of dust, cold metal, and old paper. The high window was filmed with grime, letting in a weak square of winter light. Richard leaned against the wall, one hand flat on the peeling paint, the other still holding his head. Emily shut the door almost fully, leaving only a crack. Stay here, she said. He looked at her then, and in his eyes there was fear, not the large dramatic fear of a man facing a gun or a fire, but the bewildered fear of someone whose own mind had become unsafe. What if she knows who I am? Emily's answer should have been simple. Then we ask her, then we call the police, then we let your people take you home. Instead, she thought of the woman's gloves, the photograph, the cold certainty, the expensive car waiting outside the station like a black beetle. She thought of the way Richard had flinched without knowing why. I'll find out what she wants first, Emily said. His fingers caught her wrist. It was not forceful. It was worse than forceful. It was trusting. Don't let her take me, he said. Something inside Emily softened painfully. I won't. When she returned to the ticket hall, Vanessa Langford was speaking again. Emily had not yet heard her name, but she already knew the kind of world that had taught this woman to expect doors to open. She stood with her chin slightly lifted, her gaze passing over the station posters, the cracked notice board, the charity tin by the ticket window, and finding everything mildly regrettable. Arthur had set the photograph on the counter between them. If he is here, the woman said, it would be better for everyone if you cooperated. He may be confused. He may even have told you things that are not true. Arthur's voice remained flat. You said he might not be using his real name. What name would that be then? A small pause. Richard Morgan. The name meant nothing to Emily at first, then it meant too much, too quickly. Morgan. Morgan Capital, Morgan Group, the redevelopment notice pinned crookedly beside the ticket window. The one Arthur had pretended not to worry over, the planned closure consultation. The rumors that Helwick Station would be swallowed by some transport optimization strategy, designed by people who had never waited for the 6:12 in the rain. Emily felt cold spread from her hands to her elbows. The woman watched Arthur carefully. I am Vanessa Langford. I represent parties who are deeply concerned for Richard's welfare. Family? Arthur asked. Close enough. The answer slid away from truth like water from glass. Emily moved into view. If you're concerned, why didn't you go to the police? Vanessa turned. Her eyes settled on Emily's uniform first, then her face. It was not an openly cruel look. That would have been easier. It was a swift calculation. Polite on the surface and dismissive underneath. And you are Emily Watson, station staff. Then perhaps you can help. Vanessa took one step closer. Mr. Morgan was involved in an accident. He is vulnerable, not himself, and may be in the company of people who do not understand the seriousness of his position. Emily heard the hidden blade. People, company, position. Arthur also heard it because his jaw tightened. Vanessa opened her handbag again. This time she withdrew a slim cream envelope and placed it on the counter beside the photograph. There is a reward for reliable information. A substantial one. For a moment, the entire station seemed to hear the envelope land. Mr. Dale looked over his newspaper. The woman from the flower stall, who had come in to ask about weekend tickets, stopped by the timetable board. No price. passing through with a toolbox in one hand and half a sandwich in the other, slowed as if someone had pulled a wire through his back. Money did not need to be named to be loud. Arthur did not touch the envelope. We're not that kind of station. Vanessa smiled faintly. Every station is that kind of station when the amount is high enough. Emily stepped forward before she could stop herself. You can put that away. Vanessa's gaze sharpened, just a fraction. Loyalty is admirable, Miss Watson. Misplaced loyalty is dangerous. I wouldn't know, Emily said. I've never tried buying it. The silence that followed was not empty. It gathered witnesses. Vanessa's smile disappeared. Arthur gave Emily the kind of look that meant careful, lass. But there was pride beneath it. From behind the signal room door, Emily heard the faintest sound, a chair leg scraping perhaps, or Richard shifting as another wave of pain hit him. Her spine stiffened. Vanessa heard it too. Her eyes moved past Emily toward the passage. Is there someone back there, Noah? Emily said quickly, glancing toward him. Noah, bless his bewildered, sandwich-holding heart, swallowed the last bite whole and stepped forward. Me. I'm always making noise. It's a medical condition, probably. Arthur coughed once, which might have been a laugh strangled for professional reasons. Vanessa did not appear amused. I will return, she said. And I advise you to consider carefully what you are involving yourselves in. Richard Morgan is not a lost tourist. He is not a stray dog to be sheltered above a bakery. He belongs to a world you cannot enter and would not survive. Emily should have looked away. She did not. People don't belong to worlds, she said quietly. They belong to themselves. For the first time, something like anger colored Vanessa's face. Not much, just enough to reveal that beneath the smoothness was a woman used to winning without being questioned. She took back the photograph but left the envelope where it was. Arthur pushed it after her with 2 fingers. You forgot your substantial concern. Vanessa did not take it. Keep it, she said, or burn it. Either way, remember that I offered courtesy first. She turned and walked out, her heels striking the worn floor with small, precise verdicts. The moment the station door closed, the noise returned too brightly. Someone whispered near the timetable board. Mr. Dale folded his newspaper very slowly. Noah exhaled so hard his fringe moved. Arthur reached for the envelope, opened it, and glanced inside. His expression changed despite himself. How much? Noah asked. Arthur shut it. Enough to make fools of decent people. Emily's stomach turned. Within half an hour, Hailwick began doing what small towns did when frightened. It made a story out of fragments and passed it from hand to hand until everyone had touched it. By lunchtime, Mrs. Whitby had heard that Emily was hiding a man wanted by London police. By 1:30, the flower stall woman's sister told 3 customers that the man was actually a runaway lord who had fallen in love with Emily after she nursed him through brain fever. By 2, old Mr. Price at the hardware shop claimed he had seen the stranger carrying stolen jewels in a railway duffel, which was impressive, considering Richard owned duffel and had spent the morning sorting lost property tags under Arthur's supervision. But gossip did not need accuracy to wound. Emily felt it in the glances, in the sudden pauses when she entered the bakery, in the way Mrs. Whitby's assistant, Lucy, asked too casually whether that gentleman upstairs would be staying long. Even kindness grew strained when reputation came under pressure. Mrs. Whitby defended her at once, of course. If Emily Watson says the man needs help, then help is what he needs, she declared, slapping dough onto the counter as if it had insulted her personally. Still, Emily saw the concern in the older woman's eyes. Love, Mrs. Whitby said more softly when they were alone by the ovens. Be sure your heart isn't standing where your head ought to be. Emily looked toward the ceiling, where Richard was resting in the little room above. I don't even know what my heart is doing. That was the honest truth. All afternoon she moved between station duties and bakery errands, as if balancing cups on a tray while the floor tilted beneath her. She had not lied, not exactly. She had protected a man who was injured and afraid. Yet each hour made that protection resemble something darker: concealment, defiance, betrayal. And the worst part was the name, Richard Morgan. When she finally found him in the back room of the bakery, he was sitting by the small window, shoulders bent, looking less like the man in Vanessa's photograph than ever. Mrs. Whitby had wrapped a blanket around him, and someone, probably No, had left a crossword beside his tea. He looked up when Emily came in. "She's gone?" he asked. For now, he heard the rest inside those two words. "You know something." Emily sat opposite him. Between them, the little table held a chipped sugar bowl, a butter knife, and everything neither of them understood. She said, "Your name is Richard Morgan." He repeated it silently, his brow furrowed, not with recognition but with effort. "Morgan." Emily watched him, searching for vanity, for guilt, for some flash of the man in the photograph. She found only pain. "Does it mean anything?" she asked. His hand went to his temple again. "A building. Glass. Someone calling my name across a room. I can't see their face." His breath shook. "And that woman, I know I should know her." She said she was close enough to family. Richard gave a humorless little laugh. "That sounds like something people say when they aren't." Emily wanted to smile, she couldn't. "There's more," she said. "Morgan Group is connected to the station closure." He stared at her. There it was, the gap opening under both of them. He looked as shocked as she felt. But shock did not erase the fact that his name might be written somewhere on papers that could destroy the place she loved. "I didn't know," he said. "I know you didn't. But did she? How much could a person not know about himself and still remain innocent?" Richard's face tightened, as if he had heard the question, though she had not spoken it. "Emily, whatever I was, whoever I was, I don't want to hurt this town." The words came too quickly, too earnestly. She believed them. That frightened her more. Because belief was not evidence, trust was not protection, and Vanessa Langford had brought with her a world where truth would be measured in documents, reputations, legal threats, and money left in cream envelopes. A knock sounded below. Mrs. Whitby's voice rose in greeting, then fell into a cautious murmur. Moments later, she came upstairs holding a small ivory card between two flour-dusted fingers. "She left this at the station, Mrs." Whitby said. "Arthur sent Noah over with it," said Emily. "Ought to see." Emily took the card. Vanessa Langford's name was engraved in dark blue. Beneath it were a London address, a private number, and an email belonging to Morgan Group's corporate office. But it was the crest at the top that drew the room into silence. A silver emblem, two lions flanking a narrow tower, with a small rail-like line beneath it, elegant and severe. Emily barely had time to understand it. Before Richard stood so abruptly, the chair scraped back, his face seed of colour. The blanket slipped from his shoulders to the floor. He reached for the card, but stopped before touching it, his hand suspended in the air, as if the symbol itself could injure him. Then, in a voice that did not sound entirely like his own, he whispered, "I've seen that before." For a long moment, nobody moved. The little ivory card lay on Emily's palm, as if it had grown heavier than paper had any right to be. Outside the bakery window, Halewick's afternoon wore its usual winter grey, the roofs damp with mist, the chimneys breathing pale smoke into the air downstairs. Someone laughed as Mrs. Whitby's bell chimed over the shop door. Life continued in its small, ordinary way, but in the room above the bakery, something had shifted. Richard stood barefoot on the worn rug, his eyes fixed on the crest at the top of Vanessa Langford's card. His face was not the face Emily had come to know in the last weeks, not the man who burned toast with grave concentration, who apologized to tea kettles when he knocked them with his elbow, who listened to old Mrs. Hargreaves describe her cat's digestion as if it were parliamentary news. This Richard looked carved out of a colder world. "I've seen that before," he had said. The words seemed to frighten him as much as they startled her. Emily closed her fingers slowly over the card. Where? He blinked once, twice, his hand lowered. The color did not return to his face. I don't know. It should have been an honest answer. It had been the answer to almost everything since she had found him on platform 3, injured, soaked through, and shivering under the broken light. I don't know. Where are you from? I don't know. Who should we call? I don't know. Why were you on that train? I don't know. But this time Emily heard something else beneath it. A door closing. Mrs. Whitby glanced between them, her kind eyes tightening with worry. Sit down, love. You look as if you might fall over. Richard obeyed, but not because he was weak. He sat like a man restraining himself, elbows on his knees. Fingers pressed together so tightly the knuckles turned pale. Emily watched him and felt, for the first time, that his lost past was not merely a blank space. It was a shadow. That night the memories came back to him in fragments. He did not tell Emily. He lay in the narrow bed above Mrs. Whitby's bakery, while the scent of yeast and sugar slept in the walls, while the old pipes clicked and sighed, while Halewick settled into the soft silence of a town that trusted tomorrow would arrive by train. His eyes stayed open in the dark, a glass boardroom, rain running down the windows of a tower so high the city below looked like a map made of cold light. Men in charcoal suits seated around a table too polished to belong to human hands. A woman standing near the window, dark hair pinned neatly, a diamond at her throat. Vanessa. He knew her name now with an unpleasant certainty, as if the sound had been stamped into his life by someone else. Then a voice sharp with anger. You are being sentimental, Richard. Another voice, older, smooth, familiar. Halewick is a failing asset. Sentiment is exactly what your father warned you against. Richard sat up in bed, breath catching. His head throbbed. He pressed the heel of his hand against his temple, but the image only sharpened. A folder sliding across the glass, a rail map marked in red, a black pen placed beside a document, then another fragment, a train ticket in his hand, London to Halewick, first class. Departure, 1842, the paper damp at one corner from rain or from his own palm. He remembered standing somewhere bright and echoing, surrounded by announcements and hurried footsteps, while someone spoke close to his ear. You should not go there alone. He saw a cufflink, silver, 2 lions and a tower, then the warning, low and urgent, almost swallowed by the noise of the station. Someone close to you wants you gone. Richard gripped the blanket. For several minutes, he could not breathe properly. The next morning, Emily found him in Mrs. Whitby's kitchen, staring into a cup of tea gone cold. He had not shaved. There were shadows beneath his eyes. A smear of flour marked his sleeve, from when Mrs. Whitby had wordlessly pressed him into helping with rolls, as if work could stop a soul from splintering. You didn't sleep, Emily said. He looked up too quickly. Neither did you. It was true. She had spent half the night turning the ivory card over in her mind. Vanessa's elegant name glowing like frost. She had told herself it was none of her business. Richard's past would return when it returned. A decent person did not pry at another person's wounds. But decency did not stop hurt. Did you remember something? She asked. Richard's fingers tightened around the mug. There it was again, that almost invisible pause. A breath too long. A choice being made in front of her. Only pieces, he said. Emily waited. He looked down. Nothing useful. The words were not cruel, that made them worse. If he had snapped at her, she could have been angry. If he had lied badly, she could have accused him. But this soft carefulness, this gentle wall being built between them brick by brick, left her standing outside with no proper weapon except sadness. Right, she said. He lifted his head, and something like panic crossed his expression. Emily, I'm late for work. She was not late. They both knew it. But she took her coat from the chair and left before his concern could undo her. All day at the station, she moved with efficient quietness. She checked timetables, helped an elderly man with his luggage, replaced a cracked notice in the waiting room, and listened while Arthur Bell grumbled about frozen switches and council paperwork. Platform 3 smelled of rain, iron, and old stone. It had always steadied her. The station did not ask who you were before offering shelter. It simply stood, noticed her mood before noon. "He's done something daft, hasn't he?" he asked while pretending to inspect the ticket machine. Emily did not look at him. "Who?" The tall mystery tragedy with the cheekbones. Despite herself, she almost smiled. "Don't call him that, so yes." She adjusted the stack of charity raffle flyers on the counter. The winter charity event was that evening, and half the town had donated something. Jam, knitted scarves, a bicycle no one wanted to admit was too small, and 3 fruitcakes with competing levels of threat. The funds would go to the railway hardship pot and the food pantry. "It's nothing," Emily said. Noah leaned one shoulder against the wall. "Nothing tends to make your mouth go all straight like that." She gave him a warning look. He raised both hands. "Fine, I'll go wrestle the printer and leave your emotional repression in peace." But after he left, Emily's gaze drifted toward the far end of the platform, where she had found Richard that first night. She remembered crouching beside him in the rain, her hands shaking as she touched his shoulder. She remembered his eyes opening, confused and defenseless. Back then, he had looked at her as if she were the only solid thing in the world. Now she wondered whether the world he came from was already reaching through him to take him back. By late afternoon, the station transformed. Strings of warm yellow lights looped along the ticket hall misses. Whitby arrived with trays of mince pies and iced buns, commanding 2 teenage volunteers as if she were leading a military operation. Arthur wore his best railway tie, which meant the navy one, without a coffee stain. A school choir gathered under the departure board, whispering and giggling into their scarves. Even the old station clock seemed kinder beneath its halo of light, its black hands moving with solemn patience above the hall. Emily was tying ribbon around the donation box when Richard appeared. He wore the donated coat Mrs. Whitby had found for him weeks ago, but tonight he had somehow made it look different. His posture was straighter, his hair combed back from his forehead, his expression quieter. He looked not wealthy exactly, not in anything so obvious as fabric or watch or shoes, but composed in a way that did not belong to a man with no name. Emily felt her heart betray her with one painful lift. He came to her side. "Can I help?" She concentrated on the ribbon. "Mrs. Whitby needs someone to carry the tea urn." "I already did. She told me I carried it with the sorrow of a poet and the grip of a banker." Emily's fingers stilled. Richard seemed to realize what he had said at the same moment she did. His mouth closed. The small accidental word hung between them. A banker. Emily pulled the ribbon tight, too tight, crushing the bow. Before either of them could speak, a booming voice filled the hall. Councillor Peter Alden had arrived, red-faced from cold and importance. He shook Arthur's hand, praised the choir loudly before they had sung a note, and positioned himself near the donation table, where people could best admire his generosity. He had been on the council for 15 years, and had perfected the art of sounding benevolent while doing very little. "Miss Watson," he said, spotting Emily. "Still holding the place together, I see. I try," Emily replied politely. His gaze skimmed over her uniform, the mended cuff she had hoped no one would notice, the sensible shoes polished thin with use. "Your family always did know how to make do. Your mother was the same, God rest her. Proud as anything, even when there wasn't much to be proud of." The words landed softly enough that several people smiled uncertainly, unsure whether they were meant to be kind. Emily's back went still. Alden continued, warmed by his own voice. "That's what I admire about people like you. No airs, no pretending to be above your station, if you'll pardon the pun." Someone gave an awkward chuckle. Emily felt heat rise from her collar to her cheeks. Poverty, she had learned young, was something other people felt entitled to mention in public. provided they wrapped it in praise. They could call your endurance admirable, while reminding everyone what you had endured. They could pat dignity on the head and call it humility. She opened her mouth, but no words came, not because she had none, because too many had been buried for too long. Then Richard stepped forward, not loudly, not dramatically. He simply moved, and the air around him changed. "Counselor," he said. Alden turned, surprised. "And you are a man currently enjoying the hospitality of this town." Richard's voice was calm, low, perfectly controlled. "Which gives me reason to object when one of its finest people is insulted under the disguise of charity." The hall quieted. Emily stared. Alden's smile stiffened. "I'm sure you misunderstood." "I'm sure I didn't." There was no anger in Richard's tone. That was what made it devastating. He spoke like someone used to rooms falling silent when he wished to be heard. "You referenced Miss Watson's family circumstances, diminished her mother's pride, and implied that her proper place is beneath yours. In fewer than 30 seconds, you converted a charity event into a display of condescension. It was efficient, I'll grant you that." Mrs. Whitby froze with a tray in her hands. No's mouth fell open. Arthur's brows rose nearly to his cap. Alden reddened. "No," Richard said, still quiet. "You see here, Emily Watson keeps this station running with more competence, restraint, and grace than most institutions manage with entire departments. If pride is measured by service, she outranks every person in this hall." The silence changed. It became something warm, something protective. Emily's throat tightened so fiercely, she had to look away. Alden muttered something about youthful sensitivity and retreated toward the mulled wine. Conversations resumed slowly, then louder, as if the town needed noise to cover the fact that something true had just been said. Richard turned to Emily, and the authority vanished from his face, leaving only worry. "I'm sorry," he said. "I may have made that worse." She gave a small, unsteady laugh. "You made Councillor Alden look as if he swallowed a railway spike. That sounds undesirable." It was magnificent. His eyes softened, but Emily could not let herself stay inside that softness too long. Because beneath her gratitude, beneath the painful warmth of being defended, another feeling had begun to bloom. Fear. Who was he? Men who drifted into small towns without memory did not speak like that. They did not dismantle public insults with the precision of legal counsel. They did not carry themselves as if every room had once belonged to them. Later, after the choir sang and the raffle was drawn and Mrs. Whitby cried, because the unwanted bicycle somehow raised £40, Emily slipped out onto platform 3. Snow had begun to fall. Not enough to settle. Only fine white flecks turning under the lamps. The station clock glowed above the entrance to the hall. Its hands stood at nearly 9. Richard found her there. For a while they stood side by side, watching their breath disappear. "You're angry with me," he said. Emily folded her arms against the cold. "I don't know what I am. I wanted to tell you. That usually means you didn't." He flinched, and she hated that it hurt her to see it. "Emily, I'm remembering things. Not enough to understand them. Enough to know they may change everything." She looked at him then. "And you decided I couldn't handle that." "No." His voice broke slightly. "I decided I couldn't handle the way you might look at me after." The honesty came too late, but it came. Emily felt it strike the part of her that had been trying to harden. "Richard," she said softly, "I'm already looking." Snow touched his hair, his coat, his lashes. He seemed unbearably alone for a man standing close enough to reach. "I don't want to lose the only life that has ever felt real to me," he said. Emily's chest ached. She should have stepped back. She should have asked what life, whose life, what truth he was hiding instead. She remembered his hands awkwardly kneading dough in Mrs. Whitby's kitchen. His laughter when Noah tricked him into cleaning pigeon mess. His quiet attention when she spoke of her mother. She remembered that whatever his past contained, the man before her had learned kindness here, and had given it back. "Then stop standing outside it," she whispered. Richard's gaze dropped to her mouth. The station seemed to hold its breath. When he bent toward her, it was not with the confidence he had shown in the hall. It was careful, almost reverent, as if he still believed she might vanish. Emily should have been sensible. She had spent her whole life being sensible. But the first touch of his lips was warm against the winter air, and all her careful defenses loosened at once. He kissed her under the old station clock, beneath the patient hands that had watched arrivals, departures, farewells, and impossible returns. For one suspended moment, Emily forgot ivory cards, hidden memories, and the distance between unknown worlds. Then, Richard went rigid. His mouth left hers, his eyes widened, but he was no longer seeing the platform, he was seeing glass, a boardroom, a document. His own hand holding a black pen above a signature line. Morgan Capital Strategic Rail Consolidation and Redevelopment Agreement. Hailwick Branch Closure Authorization. His signature already drying at the bottom. And beside him, a familiar voice saying, "Once this is signed, Richard, that little station will finally stop costing us money." For a heartbeat, Richard did not breathe. The platform around him remained exactly the same. The thin frost along the yellow safety line, the weak gold of the station lamps, the distant murmur from Mrs. Whitby's bakery van in the car park. Emily standing close enough for him to feel the warmth of her coat sleeve against his hand. Yet inside his skull, something had split open. Images did not return like memories. They returned like punishment. A long table of polished walnut, men in dark suits, the cold scent of leather chairs and expensive coffee, his Uncle Edmund's fingers resting on a folder stamped confidential. A map of Hailwick spread under boardroom lights, its narrow tracks marked in red, its station building shaded for demolition. Hailwick Branch Closure Authorization. Richard staggered back one step. Emily reached for him at once. "James?" The name struck him with a tenderness that almost broke him. James. The man she had found. The man with no wallet, no history, no arrogance left to defend him. The man who had learned how to stack bread trays outside Whitby's bakery and burn toast in the little flat above it. The man who had watched Emily check the timetable board with that thoughtful crease between her brows and wondered how anyone could care so deeply about trains that were always late. He had loved being James because James had owed nothing to anyone except gratitude. But that was not his name. Another wave came, sharper than the first, a rain-slicked London street, headlights. His phone ringing again and again. Vanessa's name glowing on the screen. Edmund's voice from earlier that night, smooth as a locked door. "You're hesitating because you've spent too much time listening to sentiment. Redevelopment is not cruelty. Richard, it is progress." Then the squeal of brakes. Metal. Glass. Darkness. Richard pressed both hands to his temples. His knees nearly gave way. "Arthur!" Emily called, her voice suddenly stripped of all softness. "Arthur, come here." But Richard caught her wrist before she could turn away. Not hard. Desperate. "Emily," he said. The sound of her real name in his voice made her freeze. He had said her name countless times before, but never like that, never as if it belonged to the last clean thing in a collapsing world. Her eyes searched his face. "What is it? Are you in pain?" "Yes," he wanted to say, but not the kind you can bandage. He looked at the station behind her, the old brick walls darkened by winter, the ticket office window taped at one corner, the station clock above platform, 3 ticking with a dignity that no corporate report had ever understood. He saw Arthur Bell in the doorway of the staff room, grey brows drawn together. He saw Noah Price near the signal room steps, holding a toolbox watching with puzzled concern. He saw Mrs. Whitby beyond the fence, her flour-dusted apron bright against the dusk. All of them had become real to him slowly, through ordinary days, and somewhere in the life he had forgotten, he had treated them as numbers. "I remember," he whispered. Emily's expression changed. Hope came first. It bloomed quickly, instinctively, because she was kind before she was cautious. Then fear followed, because she knew before he told her that memory was not always mercy. You remember who you are? Richard opened his mouth. For the first time in his adult life, Richard Morgan, chairman of Morgan Capital, did not know how to speak. His name had once opened doors before he reached them. It had signed away jobs, bought silence, crushed opposition beneath legal language and shareholder confidence. He had worn it like armor. Now it felt like a verdict. I need to explain, he said. Before anyone else. Emily, you have to hear it from me. The station loudspeaker crackled suddenly overhead, startling them both. A delayed service announcement drifted out in Arthur's tired voice. Practical and familiar, the normality of it cut Richard deeper than panic would have. Emily drew her hand back slowly, not away from disgust, not yet, but away because she felt him hiding something, and her pride was waking. Then explain. Richard looked at her small bare fingers and curled beside the sleeve of her Navy station coat. Those hands had cleaned blood from his forehead, had placed a cup of tea beside his bed without asking payment, had straightened his borrowed collar before his first shift helping Arthur with platform maintenance, smiling, as if being useful was no small thing. My name isn't James, he said. Emily went very still. He forced himself onward. It's Richard. Something flickered in her eyes. Not recognition yet, only confusion. Richard was too common a name to wound by itself. Richard Morgan. The name landed between them heavier than any train. Emily stared at him. Behind her, Arthur stepped fully onto the platform. Noah's toolbox lowered slowly to the ground with a dull clank. The little town did not move, but the air changed. Everyone in Halwick knew Morgan Capital. The name had appeared on formal letters pinned inside the town hall, on redevelopment notices, on articles about transport efficiency and commercial opportunity. It had been spoken with anger over bakery counters, in council meetings, at kitchen tables where people counted savings and wondered if they would have to move. Emily's lips parted, but no words came. Richard wished she would shout. He wished she would slap him, accuse him, do anything that gave shape to the hurt forming in her face. Her silence was worse, because it was full of things she was too disciplined to say. I didn't know, he said quickly, then hated himself for how weak it sounded. When I was here I didn't know, I swear to you. But before? Her voice was quiet. He closed his eyes for a fraction of a second. More memories crashed through him. An office on the 42nd floor, Edmund standing at the window, Vanessa beside the conference table, elegant in cream silk, reviewing an invitation list for a charity gala while men discussed displacement compensation as if it were weather. Richard's own voice, cooler than he could bear to hear now. If the Halwick line continues operating at a loss, consolidation is inevitable. He had not cared enough to look beyond the spreadsheet. I signed documents, he admitted. The words scraped his throat. I thought it was one branch closure in a wider restructuring. I didn't understand what it meant here. I didn't know you. I didn't know Arthur, or Mrs. Whitby, or the businesses relying on the station. Emily gave a small, almost invisible flinch when he said Mrs. Whitby's name. That makes it better, she asked. No, he shook his head. No, it makes it worse. Because I should have known before someone had to love me into seeing people. Her eyes shone then, and it nearly ruined him. Arthur came closer, his face hard with the restraint of an older man who had seen too many institutions apologize after the damage was done. Morgan Capital has been pushing the closure hearing forward while you've been missing. Richard turned sharply. What? Noah found his voice. The revised plan came through last week. Demolition schedule, commercial units, private apartments. They said your board had confirmed authority. Richard felt cold move through him. Edmund, the name returned with another blade of memory. His uncle at the head of a table that was not Edmund, smiling for photographers outside Morgan Capital headquarters. A statement drafted in elegant phrases. In light of Mr. Morgan's temporary absence, the executive committee remains committed to continuity. Continuity, a beautiful word for theft. And Vanessa, Richard murmured. Emily heard the name. Of course she did. Who is Vanessa? Before he could answer, a strange sound rose from beyond the station entrance. Not a train. Engines. Several cars pulled up outside in quick succession. Doors slammed. Voices gathered too fast, too eagerly, carrying through the old iron gates and across the platform. Mr. Morgan. Richard, look this way. Can you confirm where you've been hiding? Is it true you were living with a local woman? Emily turned toward the noise, confusion tightening into alarm. Arthur swore under his breath. Noah moved instinctively toward the signal room door, as if the railway itself might provide cover. Mrs. Whitby hurried from the car park, then stopped when she saw the first camera flash explode against the station windows. Richard's blood turned to ice. They had found him. No, not found. Been sent. The press poured through the entrance in a wave of woolcoats, microphones, camera lenses, and hungry faces. Hailwick Station, which had survived snow closures, budget cuts, drunken Saturday passengers, and years of neglect, suddenly looked painfully small beneath the weight of national attention. Emily stepped back as a reporter thrust a microphone toward her. Miss Watson, did you know the man staying above Whitby's bakery was billionaire Richard Morgan? Another voice cut in. Were you aware his company owns the redevelopment rights to this station? Did he promise you compensation? Are you in a relationship with him? Each question struck like mud flung at glass. Emily's face drained of color, but her chin lifted. Richard moved in front of her without thinking. Back away, he said, and for 1 second the voice that came from him was not James at all. It was Richard Morgan, boardroom forged, obeyed by people who feared consequences. The reporters hesitated. Then black-suited security men pushed through the crowd from the station entrance. Not local police. Private protection. His protection. Men trained to form a human wall around wealth. Their earpieces glinted beneath the platform lamps as they closed around Richard with efficient precision. The sight seemed to stun Emily more than the cameras, because there, in the space of a few seconds, the man who had helped carry sacks of flour for Mrs. Whitby vanished behind shoulders wider than doorframes and orders spoken into cuffs. Sir, we need to move you now, one guard said. Richard shoved at the arm in front of him. No, I'm not leaving her, Mr. Morgan. This location is compromised, he heard Emily inhale. Mr. Morgan. Not James, never James again, he turned, fighting the human wall that had arrived to restore him to a life he no longer recognized as safety. Emily, listen to me. Edmund is behind this. I need time, but I can stop the closure. I can. A silver car door opened. Near the entrance. The crowd shifted. Vanessa Langford stepped onto the platform as if it were a red carpet, rather than a small-town station smelling faintly of diesel, rain, and old wood. She wore a pale coat, belted at the waist, her hair smooth despite the wind, her expression arranged into public concern. Cameras turned toward her eagerly, recognizing beauty, money, and scandal in one polished frame. Richard went still. Vanessa's gaze passed over Emily with the soft cruelty of someone noticing a stain on silk. Then she moved to Richard's side and placed a gloved hand on his arm. There you are, she said, clear enough for the microphones. Gentle enough to sound devoted. We've all been so worried. Richard pulled his arm away. Vanessa, don't. But she had already turned slightly, giving the cameras the angle they wanted. Her eyes gleamed, not with relief, but victory. Emily stood beyond the ring of bodyguards, small beneath the station clock, separated from him by lenses, suits, and the truth he had delivered too late. Vanessa smiled for the crowd and said, "Please give my future husband some space." The words traveled across platform 3 with perfect, merciless clarity. Emily looked from Vanessa's hand to Richard's face, and in that instant he saw the moment her heart understood. The world he came from, had not merely found him, it had come to take him back. By the time the first black car pulled away from Halwick Station, the rain had begun again. It came softly at first, tapping against the glass canopy above platform 3, blurring the reflection of the station clock until its hands seemed to tremble. Emily stood beneath it long after the cameras had turned, long after Vanessa Langford's perfume had been replaced by the smell of wet stone and diesel, long after Richard had looked back through the tinted window. With a face so pale it was almost unfamiliar, he had not gone willingly. She knew that, yet knowing did not make the platform less empty. There was a particular kind of silence after a train left a small station. It was never complete silence. There was always the hum of signal boxes, the rustle of old posters, the distant clank of rails contracting in the cold. But that afternoon, everything sounded as if it came from very far away, as though Emily herself had been left behind in a world where time continued out of habit. Arthur Bell found her still standing there 10 minutes later. His old navy coat was damp at the shoulders, and his expression held the difficult softness of a man who had seen enough departures to understand some were not written on the timetable. "Emily," he said quietly. "Come inside." She blinked, as if remembering her own body. Her hands were cold. She had not realized she was gripping the edge of her uniform jacket until her fingers ached. "I should check the waiting room," she said. "I've checked it. The lost property log. Can wait." She gave a small nod, but she did not move. Arthur stepped beside her, not too close. He looked back. The words, meant as comfort, almost broke her. Emily swallowed hard and stared down the shining tracks. So do passengers when they've left something behind. Arthur's face tightened. He had no answer for that, and because he cared for her, he did not pretend to have one. In London, Richard Morgan returned to his own life, as if being swallowed by a machine built in his name. The car did not take him to a hospital, though a doctor waited for him in the penthouse. It did not take him somewhere quiet, though his head pulsed from the sudden return of memory and the sharper violence of recognition. It carried him past stone terraces, embassy gates, private clubs with polished brass plaques, and finally into an underground entrance beneath a tower of glass, where Morgan Capital's insignia shone silver against black marble. By evening, the official statement had already been released. Richard Morgan, executive chairman of Morgan Capital, had been found alive after a period of medically confirmed disorientation. Following a transport accident, he was recovering privately with family. He was grateful for public concern. Business continuity had never been at risk. The statement said nothing of Halwick, nothing of Mrs. Whitby's warm kitchen above the bakery, where he had learned to crack eggs without dropping shell into the bowl. Nothing of Noah laughing when Richard mistook a signal relay cabinet for a fuse box. Nothing of Arthur handing him a broom and saying, "If you're staying, you're useful." Nothing of Emily Watson wrapping a wool scarf around his neck on a morning of hard frost, scolding him for forgetting gloves, while looking at him as if his life mattered without explanation. By 9 o'clock, the miracle had been staged. Richard sat in the Morgan Capital boardroom, under lights too bright to be accidental. Around the table were directors, lawyers, advisors, men and women in dark suits whose eyes searched him less for injury than for weakness. At the far end, Edmund Morgan stood like a man receiving guests in a house he had already begun to redecorate. "My nephew's return is a blessing," Edmund said to the gathered board, his voice warm, grave, and utterly practiced. "For the family, for the company, and for our shareholders." Richard's fingers curled beneath the table. Vanessa sat to his right, immaculate in cream silk, a diamond on her hand that the media had already begun calling a symbol of steadfast devotion. It was not the ring that bothered him most. It was the ease with which everyone accepted it as truth. When Richard pushed back his chair, a dozen eyes lifted. "I want my phone," he said. Edmund gave a small sigh. almost paternal. "Richard, you've been through a neurological trauma. The doctor advised rest, my phone. We're filtering communication for your own safety." Vanessa leaned closer, lowering her voice in a way designed to look intimate. "There are people who may try to take advantage of your confusion. You don't have to deal with them tonight." He turned to her. "Do not speak about Emily." Her smile faltered only for a second. Edmund's gaze sharpened. "That young woman is precisely why we must be careful." The room became colder. Richard stood fully now. For the first time since returning, the people around the table saw not an injured heir, not a family asset recovered, but a man on the edge of something dangerous. "What have you done?" he asked. Edmund folded his hands. "We have initiated a review. You disappeared, then resurfaced in the company of a station employee with unexplained access to you, your belongings, and potentially sensitive information. It would be negligent not to investigate. She saved me, so she claims." Richard took one step forward. Vanessa's hand touched his sleeve again, and he pulled away so sharply that several directors looked down at their notes. "She found me bleeding and lost on a railway platform," he said. "She gave me shelter when none of you even knew where I was." Edmund's expression did not change, but his voice lowered. "And during that time, did she know who you were?" "No, can you prove that?" The question struck with surgical precision. Richard's memory, still knitting itself together, flashed with fragments. Emily arguing with Arthur about calling emergency services. Emily washing mud from his coat. Emily counting coins at the bakery counter. Emily laughing when he confessed he did not know whether he preferred tea with milk. She had loved the nameless man he had been. But love was not a document. Dignity was not a witness statement. And in Edmund's world, anything without paperwork could be crushed. In Halewick the next morning, Emily learned what it meant to be named by people who had never met her. The first headline appeared on a London gossip site before breakfast. "Mystery Station Girl Shelters Billionaire. Kindness or calculation?" By noon, the words had multiplied. "Small town worker at center of Morgan's scandal." "Did railway employee exploit injured financier?" From platform assistant to penthouse dream. Her photograph appeared beside Vanessa's. Emily in her blue station uniform. Hair slightly windblown, cheeks pale from shock. Vanessa in couture outside a charity gala, luminous and untouchable. The comparison required no caption. The world supplied one on its own, Mrs. Whitby slammed her bakery till shut so hard that a jar of ginger biscuits rattled. "Vultures," she declared, snatching the local paper from the counter before Emily could reach it. Ink-stained vultures with no mothers and no shame. Emily, who had come in only to help carry flour from the back, managed a smile that did not last. People will forget, no love. People forget facts. They remember poison. The bakery was warm, thick with the smell of bread and sugar, but Emily felt cold inside her bones. Every customer who entered lowered their voice too late. Every phone screen turned face down too quickly. Even kindness became painful when it arrived, wrapped in pity. No price burst in near lunchtime, cheeks red from cycling too fast in the rain. "Don't read anything online," he said, which was exactly the sentence that proved there was more online to read. Emily tied the flour sack closed. "I wasn't planning to. You also weren't planning to become the nation's favorite villain before tea." Mrs. Whitby pointed at him with a wooden spoon. "Not helpful." Noah winced. "Sorry, I mean, why going to fix it? There are station logs, CCTV, signal room backups. I can check what we still have." Emily looked up for a moment. Grief moved aside and something steadier appeared beneath it. "What do you mean, what we still have?" Noah's face changed, and in that small shift Emily understood. There were currents beneath the scandal already moving toward Halewick. Arthur said, "Morgan Capital's legal department requested preservation of records." Noah said, "All records involving Richard's time here." Mrs. Whitby's eyes narrowed. "Request? No," rubbed the back of his neck. "For now, Emily said nothing. Outside the bakery window, Hailwick continued in its modest way. A mother tugged a child across the street. The postman shook rain off his cap. The station clock rose above the rooftops, stubborn and old, marking time for people who could not afford to waste it. The closure proposal was still waiting. The redevelopment plan still hung over them like a drawn blade. Richard's return had not saved the station. If anything, it had made the battle more dangerous. Before, they had been a town resisting a corporation. Now Emily herself had become the convenient distraction. The greedy girl, the emotional manipulation, the scandal that could make every serious question disappear. That evening, she returned to work because staying home would have felt like surrender. Platform 3 shone under amber lamps. Rainwater gathered in shallow silver lines along the platform edge. Emily checked the notice boards, answered a passenger's question about the delayed Leeds connection, helped an elderly man with his suitcase, and did each task with such careful normality that Arthur watched her with worry deepening the lines around his mouth. "You don't have to prove anything tonight," he said. Emily adjusted a timetable leaflet that was already straight. "Yes, I do." "To whom?" She paused. "To the town, perhaps. To the people whispering to Richard, though he was behind glass towers and locked doors, to herself most of all. "If I stop," she said softly, "then they get to decide what I was." Arthur's expression softened with pride and sorrow together. "You were kind." Emily looked toward the place where Richard had once sat on a bench with a paper cup of tea, shivering, lost, trying to smile at her because he did not want to seem afraid. "I was foolish too," she whispered. "No," Arthur said. "You were human." Above London, Richard stood before a wall of glass in a penthouse larger than the entire upper floor of Mrs. Whitby's bakery. The city burned beneath him in gold and white. Cars moved like blood through shining arteries. Somewhere below, people were raising glasses to his return, sending carefully worded messages, increasing positions, stabilizing markets. His wardrobe had been restocked. His meals were prepared. His schedule was guarded by assistants who no longer met his eyes when he asked whether Miss Watson had called. Luxury surrounded him with the precision of a prison. He had finally gotten hold of a phone by taking one from a junior aide, who looked terrified enough to faint. Emily's number was still in his memory, not from before, but from Hailwick, from the life that now seemed more real than this one. He dialed it 3 times. The first call did not connect. The second rang once and failed. The third produced a calm recorded voice, informing him the number was unavailable. When he turned, Edmund was standing in the doorway. "You had no right," Richard said. Edmund looked almost regretful. "I had every responsibility to isolate me, to protect you from a woman whose involvement presents reputational, legal, and financial risk." Richard laughed once, without humor. "You sound like you're discussing contaminated property. In business, sentimentality is often contamination." There it was, the Morgan family creed spoken plainly. Richard looked around the penthouse, the art chosen by consultants, the leather chairs no one relaxed in, the skyline that should have meant victory. He thought of Emily's small kitchen, of mismatched voice saying, "You don't have to remember everything today, just remember you're safe." He had owned towers, accounts, influence, names on doors. He had never felt poorer. "I'm going to Hailwick," he said. "No, you are not. You forget who I am." "No, Richard." Edmund stepped into the room. "You are forgetting what you are responsible for. One unstable move, one romantic outburst, and the board will question your capacity. The press already smells weakness. Vanessa is containing the damage. I am containing the company. If you run back to that girl, you hand our enemies a knife." Richard moved close enough that Edmund's controlled expression nearly cracked. "She is not that girl." For the first time, Edmund smiled with genuine coldness. "Then I suggest you hope she is as innocent as you believe." In Halwick, the last train left at 10:42. Emily locked the staff office after checking. The incident folder twice. No had copied what he could. Arthur had moved older signal logs into a cabinet, whose key he kept on a chain beneath his shirt. None of them said aloud that they were preparing for a fight, but their movements had the hushed purpose of people boarding windows before a storm. When Emily finally reached her small terraced house, the rain had stopped. The street smelled of wet brick and fallen leaves. A single envelope lay on her doormat, thick, cream-colored, too expensive, looking to belong there. For one strange second, her heart leapt with the impossible hope that it might be from Richard. Then she saw the embossed name of a London law firm. Her fingers went numb before she opened it. The language inside was polished, formal, and brutal. It referred to her as Miss Emily Watson, employee of Halwick Station. It alleged undue influence over Mr. Richard Morgan during a period of cognitive impairment. It warned that any private records, photographs, written notes, electronic messages, station footage, personal effects, or witness accounts relating to Mr. Morgan's time in Halwick must be surrendered immediately for legal review. At the bottom, one sentence seemed to darken on the page as she read it again. Failure to comply may result in civil action for manipulation, concealment, and exploitation of a vulnerable individual. Emily stood alone in her narrow hallway, the letter trembling in her hand, outside, beyond the rooftops. The station clock struck 11. For a long minute, Emily did not move. The letter had turned the hallway colder than the rain outside. Legal words had a peculiar kind of cruelty. They did not shout, they did not slam doors. They simply stood there in neat black ink and told a person that her memories could be confiscated. Undue influence, manipulation, exploitation. Emily read those words until they lost shape, until they became nothing but dark scratches across expensive paper. Then slowly, something inside her steadied. She thought of Richard standing in Mrs. Whitby's bakery, with flour on his sleeve, trying to remember whether he preferred tea with milk or without. She thought of him mending the loose bench on platform 3 because old Mr. Kellett nearly tripped there every Thursday morning. She thought of his careful hands, his quiet embarrassment when he could not pay for a new coat, his face in the winter dusk when he said, as if discovering a foreign country, that people in Halwick seemed to notice when someone was missing. None of that had been exploitation, it had been care. And if the rich had mistaken care for a crime, then perhaps they had lived too long, in rooms where everything came with a contract. Emily folded the letter once, then again. Her hands had stopped trembling. She put on her coat, tucked the letter into her pocket, and walked back toward the station beneath a sky as low and grey as tin. Halwick Station looked smaller in the rain, its red brick walls darkened, the iron railings shining with water. The station clock was 5 minutes slow, as it had been for years, though Arthur Bell always insisted it was not slow, merely historically independent. The familiar sight hurt her more than she expected. For days she had been ashamed to stand there, ashamed of being photographed, whispered about, named in papers that had never cared whether Halwick lived or died. But the station did not look ashamed. It had held soldiers, schoolchildren, widows, commuters, runaways, reunions, last goodbyes. It had done what places like this always did, waited without complaint. Arthur was in the ticket office, sorting through old incident reports with his reading glasses low on his nose. He looked up when she entered, and whatever he saw on her face made his own expression change. What have they done now? Emily handed him the folded letter. Arthur read it without speaking. His jaw tightened once, then again. By the time he reached the final line, the old gentleness in him had been covered by something harder. They want the records surrendered, Emily said. Any footage, witness accounts, notes, anything about Richard. Arthur removed his glasses. Do they now? They say I manipulated him. The sentence came out calmly, which somehow made it more painful. Arthur's face softened. Emily, I know what happened here, she said. You know it. Mrs. Whitby knows it. Noah knows it. Half the town saw him working, helping, living like everyone else. But they've got lawyers, newspapers, polished shoes. And I have. She looked toward the rain-blurred platform. I have a station that might not exist by spring. Arthur stood slowly, with the stubborn dignity of a man who had spent 40 years refusing to let broken timetables defeat him. You have more than that, he said. You have the truth, and luckily for us, the truth leaves paperwork. By noon, the station office had become a quiet war room. Arthur unlocked filing cabinets Emily had never seen opened before. He laid out staff rotas, maintenance logs, wage slips, volunteer sign-in sheets, and platform repair reports in careful piles. There was Richard's temporary staff registration under the name Daniel Reed, the name they had used because he had arrived with no memory and no documents except a rain-damaged train receipt. There were notes in Arthur's handwriting. Assisted with luggage during northbound delay. Repaired waiting room latch. Covered early shift under supervision. No payment beyond meals and lodging. Emily touched one page lightly. Richard's signature was uneven there, as if he had been relearning his own hand. Not Richard Morgan, billionaire financier. Not the man whose face was now on financial channels and gossip columns. Just Daniel, who had once apologized to a vending machine after it refused his coins. Noah Price arrived after school with his hair damp and his backpack swinging from one shoulder, bringing the nervous energy of someone who both feared authority and loved a technical challenge. I got your message, he said, breathless. Are we doing something illegal? No, Arthur said. No, looked almost disappointed. We are doing something necessary, Emily said. That pleased him more. Noah set up his battered laptop in the signal room, a cramped space smelling of dust, old wiring, and railway grease. The monitors there hummed softly. Outside the small window, Platform 3 stretched under rain and weak light, ordinary and sacred, all at once. They'll have requested the main archive, Noah muttered, fingers flying over the keyboard. But the old signal feed backs up separately for operational review. Most people forget that because the system's ancient. Arthur gave him a look. That ancient system has survived 3 software upgrades and 2 consultants from Leeds. Exactly, Noah said. Too old to be obedient. Emily almost smiled. They began with the week Richard arrived. There he was on grainy footage, staggering under the station awning, soaked and disoriented. One hand pressed to his head. Emily watched herself rush toward him, watched Arthur call for an ambulance, watched Mrs. Whitby appear with a blanket, because Mrs. Whitby always seemed to appear when someone needed warmth. No saved the clip to an external drive. Then came the days after, Richard sweeping snow from the platform, Richard carrying Mrs. Larkin's suitcase, Richard standing beside Arthur as he learned how to read the departure board properly, Richard laughing, silently, because the cameras had no sound, when a little boy saluted him with a toy train. Each clip was ordinary. That was its power. No secret exchange. No hand reaching for money. Just a man with no past being given enough kindness to survive the present. Mrs. Whitby arrived later with a tin of ginger biscuits and a face that suggested she had come prepared to fight barristers with her bare hands if necessary. I brought the guest ledger from the bakery flat, she announced, placing a worn book on Arthur's desk, and receipts for groceries, and the note he left me when he tried to fix the boiler and made it worse. Despite everything, Emily laughed once, a small cracked sound. Mrs. Whitby squeezed her shoulder. There she is. The ledger showed Richard's stay clearly, no luxury, no hidden payments, a tiny room above the bakery, shared meals, chores in exchange for board until his identity could be confirmed. Mrs. Whitby had even kept a list of household tasks in her brisk, looping handwriting. took bins out, shelved flour delivery, burnt porridge, apologized sincerely. Emily read the last line and felt her throat close. He was happy here, Mrs. Whitby said quietly. Not every moment, of course. He was frightened too. But there were mornings when he came downstairs and looked surprised that the day wanted nothing from him except to live it. Emily looked away. The legal letter lay on the desk between them, cream-colored and poisonous. Arthur tapped it with one finger. They're trying to make you afraid before you understand what you have. And what do I have? Emily asked. Witnesses, records, footage, a community that did not ask him for a penny. Noah turned from the computer. His face, usually bright with restless mischief, had gone pale. There's something else. Arthur straightened. What? No clicked through a folder of archived operational notices. Closure documents. The station redevelopment schedule. I found metadata on the version sent to the council. It says the acceleration order was filed while Mr. Morgan was missing. Emily frowned. Richard was missing when they pushed the closure forward, looks like it. Noah swallowed, and the authorization came from Edmund Morgan's office. The room stilled, rain ticked against the window. Somewhere outside, a train passed without stopping, its force shuddering through the walls. Emily remembered Richard's face when his memory returned, the devastation in him when he realized who he was and what his company had done. She had believed, because pain wanted something simple to hold, that he had left one world and chosen another. But what if, while he had been lost and nameless on Platform 3, someone else had been using his absence like an open door? Arthur leaned over Noah's laptop. Print it. Already saving 3 copies, Noah said. Local, external and cloud. I've watched enough crime dramas not to be stupid. Mrs. Whitby nodded approvingly. Good lad. While Halwick gathered its proof, Richard Morgan stood 30 floors above London, in a boardroom made of glass, chrome and silence. The city spread beneath him in polished indifference. Cars moved like black beetles along wet roads. Across the table, directors avoided his eyes with professional discipline. Edmund sat at the far end, composed as ever, his silver hair immaculate, his cufflinks shining faintly when he moved his hands. Stability, Edmund said, is not an emotional preference, Richard. It is a market requirement. Richard had heard that tone all his life. It was the Morgan family voice, grief converted into policy, fear disguised as strategy, cruelty wrapped in clean diction. On the table before him lay internal reports. Clara had quietly forwarded during the night. He had read them 3 times, and each reading had sharpened something inside him. The Halwick closure timetable had been moved forward during his disappearance. Safety complaints on the Northern Line had been buried under procedural reviews. A maintenance alert logged 2 days before his accident had been marked non-urgent after intervention from Edmund's office. Richard lifted his eyes. You accelerated the redevelopment while I was missing. Edmund's expression did not change. The company could not drift because you were unavailable. Unavailable, Richard repeated softly. I was unconscious in a rural clinic with a head injury, and yet the market opened every morning. Something cold passed through the room. One director looked down at his pen. Before Richard could answer, the boardroom doors opened, and Vanessa Langford entered as if the building had been expecting her. She wore ivory wool, diamonds small enough to be tasteful and expensive enough to be unmistakable. Her smile was perfect, it did not reach her eyes. Forgive me, she said. I was told the meeting was running long. Richard did not stand. Came to his side, lowering her voice just enough to make the intimacy visible to everyone else. The press is circling. Investors are nervous. My father has spoken to 2 major shareholders. If we announce the engagement formally this week, it will calm everything. Richard looked at her hand as it settled lightly on the back of his chair. An engagement, a photograph on marble steps, Vanessa smiling beside him. Society reassured that the errant heir had returned to his proper place. Emily reduced to an unfortunate episode. Hailwick dismissed as sentiment. His memory tidied into scandal management. "No," he said. Vanessa's smile held, but her fingers stiffened. "Richard, this is not the moment for personal confusion." "I'm not confused." Edmund sighed, as though disappointed by a child. "You are allowing a provincial attachment to cloud your responsibilities." Richard turned to him. "Do not speak about her. Then behave in a way that prevents us from having to." For a second, the old training in Richard stirred. Remain calm, reveal nothing, concede only what strengthens your position. But Hailwick had ruined him for that kind of elegance. Emily had ruined him. She had taught him that silence, when used to protect power, was not dignity. It was complicity. He pushed back his chair. "I want the full safety archive from the Northern Line, including deleted files. I want all communications from your office during the week of my accident. And I want the Hailwick redevelopment vote suspended." Edmund's eyes hardened at last. "You overestimate the loyalty waiting for you here." "Perhaps," Richard said. "But you overestimate what I'm still willing to lose." He left the boardroom with Vanessa, calling his name behind him. Not loudly enough to seem desperate, but not softly enough to hide it. By evening, Richard was alone in his office. The city dark around him and his desk lit by the blue-white glow of 3 monitors. Clara had sent him access keys with a single message. "Be careful. Uncle knows where the bodies are buried because he helped choose the ground." He worked through layers of archived files, legal folders, maintenance logs, and restored fragments retrieved by a security consultant who owed him one favor and asked no questions. The deeper he searched, the more the accident stopped looking like misfortune and began to resemble shapeshplate drawn deliberately in fog. At 11:47 p.m., a recovered folder appeared on the screen. Deleted security cache, train 184, London to northbound line. Date of accident. Richard's hand went still on the mouse. For several seconds he could hear nothing but the pulse in his ears. He opened the file. The video was damaged, grainy, without sound at first, a corridor inside the train. The camera angled toward the first-class vestibule. Passengers blurred past in fragments. Then 2 figures came into frame. Richard saw himself. Not the man from Hailwick in a borrowed jumper, not Daniel with flour on his sleeve, but Richard Morgan in a dark suit, face tense, mouth moving sharply. Opposite him stood Edmund. They were arguing. Richard leaned closer to the screen, his breath caught somewhere painfully in his chest. Edmund's hand closed around his arm. Richard pulled away. The train lurched slightly. The timestamp blinked. Minutes before the accident, then the corrupted audio cracked alive for 1 jagged second. Just long enough for Richard to hear his own voice say, furious and clear, "If Hailwick is part of this, I'll expose you." The file froze on Edmund's face, not surprised, not afraid, smiling. For a long time after the footage stopped, Richard remained seated in the dim office, one hand still resting on the mouse, as if any movement might break the thin, terrible thread connecting him to the truth. Outside the window, London glittered without remorse. In Hailwick, the night would have been softer. The station lamps would be amber, the rails dark with rain, the bakery windows fogged from early ovens. Emily would have known which train was late from the sound of the announcement before the screen refreshed. Arthur Bell would have stood beneath the station clock, with his thermos, pretending not to worry about everyone. Mrs. Whitby would have saved the last cheese scone for someone who claimed not to be hungry. And Richard, before the memory returned, had belonged there, not because anyone had given him a title, because someone had handed him a broom and trusted him to use it. Now he stared at Edmund's frozen smile and understood that his accident had not been an unfortunate interruption in corporate history. It had been convenient, perhaps too convenient. He copied the file twice, sent one encrypted version to a private server Clara had once used for family documents, and another to Noah Price, under a meaningless subject line about timetable scans. His hands were steady now. That frightened him more than trembling would have. By dawn, Richard Morgan was no longer a man trying to recover his past. He was a man preparing to dismantle it. He found Edmund in the old Morgan Capital boardroom just after 7. Before the army of assistants, lawyers, and polished young analysts arrived to populate the glass hive. The room had always been cold, even in summer. His grandfather had liked it that way. Warmth softens decisions, he used to say, while signing papers that cost hundreds of strangers their work. Edmund stood at the far end of the table, looking down at a redevelopment model of the Northern Rail Corridor. Halewick was represented by a neat grey block, smaller than Richard's palm. The station, the footbridge, the row of shops, Mrs. Whitby's bakery, the bench where Emily had once sat beside him with rain in her hair, reduced to removable plastic. "You're early," Edmund said without turning. "I could say the same. I never stopped working while you were playing station porter." Richard walked farther into the room. His reflection moved beside him in the glass wall, tailored suit, clean jaw, Morgan posture restored. Yet beneath the cuff of his shirt, he could still imagine the weight of the cheap Halewick employee badge he had kept hidden in his coat pocket. Daniel's badge, his badge, a small rectangle of plastic that had made him more accountable than any board seat ever had. "I saw the train footage," Richard said, that made Edmund turn. Only for a moment did something sharp pass through his expression. Then it was gone, tucked away beneath the family's favorite mask, amused contempt. "You saw a damaged clip of a quarrel we argued often. You always had a weakness for dramatic language. You grabbed my arm. You were agitated. I said I would expose you if Halewick was part of it." Edmund sighed as though disappointed by a child who had failed to understand a lesson. "Halewick is not a village in a storybook, Richard. It is a low-yield asset sitting in the path of a high-value project. It is a town. It is land. It is people. People relocate." Edmund's voice remained soft, almost patient. "Investments do not wait for sentiment to catch up." Richard looked at him across the shining length of the table. All his life, that table had been a river between him and ordinary mercy. On one side sat the people who made decisions. On the other, unseen, were those who paid for them. "You used my absence to push through a fraudulent valuation," Richard said. "You buried safety reports. You pressured council members, and you were prepared to close a working station by making it look like inevitable decline." Edmund smiled again, the same smile from the footage, older and clearer. "Now you have been busy. So have you. Then be intelligent for once and stop." Edmund stepped closer, lowering his voice. "There is still a way out of this. Announce a strategic review. Blame over-enthusiastic consultants. Marry Vanessa. Stabilize the family image, and let Halewick disappear quietly. In 6 months no one will remember the name." Richard's chest tightened, not from shock, but from recognition. This was the creed he had been raised inside. Loss was acceptable if it happened to other people. Cruelty was efficiency if written in the right font. Love was indulgence. Kindness was a leak in the roof of power. "And Emily?" he asked. Edmund's eyes cooled. "Miss Watson will recover. Women like her are resilient. It is their most useful quality." Richard's hand curled slowly at his side. "Careful," Edmund said. "A bruise on me would photograph beautifully." The warning was so absurdly calm that Richard almost laughed. Instead, he thought of Emily standing on platform 3, with her navy coat buttoned wrong in the rush of morning, smiling at a child who had dropped his ticket, scolding Richard for overfilling the mop bucket, pressing a paper cup of tea into his hands when she thought he looked lost. She had loved him when he had nothing useful to offer her, and these people had mistaken that for weakness. "You taught me the Morgan name survives by cutting away burdens," Richard said. "It does. No, it survives because other people carry what we cut away." For the first time, Edmund's face hardened fully. Do not make the mistake of thinking a few weeks among railway clerks has purified you. You are a Morgan. You know how this world works. Yes, Richard said. That is why I know where to cut. He left before Edmund could answer. The counterattack began quietly. Richard did not storm the company. He did not call a press conference or throw accusations into the eager mouth of scandal. Edmund had built his power through signatures, favors, buried memos, and men who owed him too much. So Richard moved through the same corridors with colder precision than anyone expected from a man they thought love had weakened. By mid-morning, the head of internal compliance, an Edmund loyalist whose reports always arrived conveniently blurred, was placed on immediate leave pending audit. 2 junior analysts, both previously ignored because they lacked the correct university accents, were reassigned to Richard's private review team. Clara, pale but determined, opened access to archived board communications she had pretended not to understand for years. A retired legal counsel who had once respected Richard's father agreed to testify if protected. And no, from a cramped office above the signal room in Halwick, sent through the first clean recovery of time-stamped station maintenance files. At the bottom of his message he had written, Emily's train to London leaves at 10:12. She's pretending she isn't scared. Richard read the sentence 3 times, then he closed his eyes. Of course she was scared. Emily was brave in the way ordinary people were brave. Not because they lacked fear, but because the rent still needed paying, the morning train still needed dispatching, and someone had to stand up when everyone else lowered their eyes. The public hearing for Halwick Station was held in a municipal chamber, refurbished with private money and bad taste. Too much glass, too many silver fixtures, too many chairs designed to make discomfort look elegant. Emily arrived in her best navy dress beneath her old coat, carrying a folder Arthur had organized twice, and she had reorganized 3 times on the train. Arthur came with her, stiff-backed and civil station manager's uniform. Mrs. Whitby had packed sandwiches no one had appetite for. No had sent printed maps, usage data, and a note that simply said, "Don't let them talk over you." But the room had been built to talk over people like Emily. Executives murmured in clusters. Lawyers slid documents from leather cases. Reporters looked up, assessed her coat, her shoes, the plain clip holding back her hair, then looked away as if she were a preface they could skip. On the far side of the chamber, Vanessa Langford sat with perfect posture and a cream suit that probably cost more than Emily's yearly groceries. Emily tried not to stare. She had seen Vanessa before in photographs beside Richard. At galas, charity auctions, art openings where no one looked as though they had ever waited in the rain for a delayed bus. Vanessa belonged to rooms like this. She did not need to raise her voice to be heard. Emily took her seat behind the small placard reading community representative. Not station worker. Not person who found him bleeding on platform 3. Not woman who had been stupid enough to believe love could stay simple. Community representative. She folded her hands to hide the tremor. The hearing began with words so polished they seemed designed to slide off meaning. Viability, modernization, strategic redundancy, economic uplift. Morgan Capital's counsel presented charts showing declining. Passenger numbers, each figure stripped of context. No mention of cancelled services that had forced commuters elsewhere. No mention of maintenance requests ignored until platforms looked tired enough to justify abandonment. No mention of the elderly who used the station for hospital appointments, or school children, or Mrs. Whitby's flower deliveries, or the way a town could begin to die, not with a disaster, but with one timetable removed at a time. When Emily was finally invited to speak, it was done with the air of granting a kindness. She stood for 1 second, the chamber blurred. Then she imagined platform 3, at dawn the clock ticking overhead. Richard beside her with a broom held the wrong way round. asking if every job had this many instructions. She began quietly. Halwick Station is not failing. It has been failed. A few heads lifted. Her voice steadied as she spoke of service reductions, neglected repairs, passenger petitions unanswered. She described Arthur's ledgers, Noah's data, the volunteers who cleared snow when contractors did not come. She did not plead. She refused to sound grateful for being allowed grief. In that room built for wealth and titles, Emily's only weapon was the truth of ordinary days, and she laid those days before them, one by one. Then Vanessa stood. She did not request permission so much as assume the room would rearrange itself around her. "I apologize for interrupting," she said, with a smile that made the apology useless. "But before the committee gives emotional weight to Miss Watson's statement, I believe transparency requires context." Emily felt Arthur shift beside her. Vanessa's assistant distributed glossy printouts to the panel, and several reporters. A photograph appeared on the chamber screen. Emily stopped breathing. It was her and Richard outside Mrs. Whitby's bakery, his hand at her waist, her face turned up toward him. Laughing, another appeared. Richard leaving Emily's cottage at dawn, edited tightly so no one could see Mrs. Whitby's delivery van beside the curb, or Arthur approaching with paperwork, another. Emily touching Richard's cheek on platform 3. The morning after a nightmare had torn through his sleep, and he had not known his own name. The captions were worse. Station workers' intimate access to Morgan Air. Romance before redevelopment objection. Conflict of interest in community testimony. A hot flush rose up Emily's throat. Around the room, attention sharpened at last, not for Halwick, not for the station, but for the shape of possible dirt. Vanessa's voice softened beautifully. "No one is questioning Miss Watson's sincerity. But when a woman forms a private attachment to a vulnerable man of substantial wealth, and then appears at a hearing that directly affects his company, surely we must ask whether this campaign is civic or personal." The words struck with surgical neatness. Emily gripped the edge of the table. For a moment she was no longer in a chamber. She was back in every shop where someone had looked at her worn purse before deciding how much respect she deserved. Every office where a man in a suit called her dear while ignoring her report. Every childhood winter when her mother counted coins and still stood straight at the counter. Gold digger, opportunist, temporary amusement. The room did not say it aloud. It did not need to. Arthur began to rise, fury whitening his face, but Emily touched his sleeve. If he defended her too fiercely, they would call him sentimental. If she cried, they would call it proof. If she shouted, they would call her unstable. So she stood there, nearly breaking, and thought of Richard. Not Richard Morgan of Morgan Capital. Daniel, who had burned toast above the bakery and apologized to it. Daniel, who had carried Mrs. Whitby's sacks of flour like they were state treasures. Daniel, who had once spent 20 minutes helping an old man find the right platform, then looked absurdly proud when the man thanked him. Daniel, who had no wallet, no memory, no surname that mattered, and had still looked at Emily as though her tiredness deserved tenderness. Her eyes stung, but her voice did not collapse. "I didn't know who he was," she said. A reporter's pen paused. Emily looked at the panel. "Not Vanessa. When I found him, he was injured, confused, and alone. He had no money, no identification, no memory at Halwick. That does not make a person an opportunity. It makes them someone you help." Vanessa's expression flickered. Emily drew a breath, and it hurt. If caring for someone with nothing is now evidence of ambition, then perhaps this room has forgotten what ordinary decency looks like. Silence fell. Not complete, but enough. Then the doors opened at the back of the chamber. The sound was small, a hinge, a shift of air, a murmur turning. Emily did not turn at first. She was afraid to hope, afraid to need him in front of them all. But the room changed before she saw him. Executives straightened. Lawyers went still. Vanessa's face lost a fraction of its careful color. Richard walked in wearing a dark suit, but he did not look like the man from the photographs. There was something different in him now, something stripped clean by memory and chosen again by will. He crossed the chamber without haste, past the reporters, past Edmund's legal team, past Vanessa, whose parted lips formed his name without sound. He stopped at Emily's table. For one heartbeat, his eyes met hers. There was apology there and love, but more than both, there was respect, as if he had not come to rescue her from the truth, but to stand inside it with her. Then Richard reached into his coat pocket. He placed a small plastic badge on the table before the panel. The Hailwick crest was scratched at one corner. The cheap clip was bent. Beneath the station logo, in plain black letters, was the name he had worn when he had owned nothing. Daniel, temporary station assistant Richard, rested his hand beside it and looked toward the hearing board. "Before anyone questions Miss Watson's motives," he said, his voice carrying through the chamber with quiet force, "you should examine mine. This is my employee badge from Halwick Station, and I am entering it as evidence." For a moment, no one in the chamber seemed to breathe. The little plastic badge lay beneath the white glare of the hearing lights, absurdly small among the polished folders, legal binders, tablets, and microphones. It had none of the authority of a corporate seal, none of the weight of a Morgan signature. It was chipped plain and cheaply printed, yet Emily felt the entire room tilt toward it. Daniel. The name had belonged to mornings before sunrise, to tea gone cold on the ticket counter, to Richard standing uncertainly beside the timetable board with a broom in his hand, and rain dampening the cuffs of his borrowed trousers. It belonged to the man who had burned toast above Mrs. Whitby's bakery, who had learned how to stamp platform passes, who had once smiled like a boy when Arthur Bell let him operate the departure board under supervision. It belonged to the man Emily had loved before she knew there was anything to gain from loving him. A murmur moved through the public gallery. First disbelief, then recognition, then the sharp hunger of reporters, realizing that the story had turned beneath their pens. The chairwoman of the hearing board leaned forward. "Mr. Morgan, are you stating on record that you were employed at Hailwick Station under another name?" Richard did not glance at Edmund. He did not look at Vanessa. His eyes remained steady, not proud, not pleading, simply open. "I am stating that after my accident, I had no memory of my identity. Miss Watson found me injured at Hailwick Station. She contacted the authorities. When no identification was found and no one came forward immediately, I was temporarily known as Daniel." His fingers rested near the badge, not touching it, as if even that small relic deserved its own space. "She did not know I was Richard Morgan. No one at the station did." Vanessa gave a soft, brittle laugh from the other side of the chamber. It was the kind of laugh women like her used at dinners where servants were expected not to hear. "How convenient," she said. "A billionaire loses his memory and happens to fall into the arms of a local woman whose station is threatened by his company." Richard turned then. The expression on his face made Vanessa's smile thin. "It was not convenient," he said. "It was cold. It was frightening. It was humiliating. I did not know my own birthday. I did not know what foods I disliked. I did not know why certain numbers made me anxious, or why my hands shook when someone mentioned London." His voice lowered. "Emily gave me soup. Arthur Bell gave me work. Mrs. Whitby gave me a roof. No Price gave me an old phone with a cracked screen and told me not to answer unknown numbers because, apparently, the whole world is full of scams." A breath of laughter rose, brief and human, before the room remembered how cruel it had been moments earlier. Richard continued, and this time his gaze moved across the board. "Hailwick did not give me a hiding place. It gave me a life worth remembering." Emily's throat tightened so painfully she had to lower her eyes. She had thought she knew the shape of her own courage. It was practical, she had always believed. The courage to work double shifts, the courage to smile at passengers who snapped at her, the courage to keep the station clean when half the town thought closure was inevitable. But this was different. This was standing in a room where powerful people had tried to make her love look like theft, and hearing the man she loved refuse to let them. Arthur sat stiffly beside her, his weathered hand curled around the edge of the table. He did not speak, but his jaw worked once, and Emily knew that for him, it was almost the same as weeping. The chairwoman adjusted her glasses. "Mr. Morgan, you said you wished to enter your motives into evidence. Do you have documentation relevant to the redevelopment decision?" Richard reached again into his coat, but this time he withdrew a sealed folder. Clara Morgan rose from the second row before anyone else could react. Pale but composed, she stepped forward and placed a small encrypted drive beside it. Edmund's face changed, not dramatically. Men like Edmund had trained their faces over decades. But Emily saw it because she had spent years noticing tiny shifts. The way a passenger's shoulder turned toward an approaching train. The way Arthur's silence meant bad news. The way Richard's smile once faltered when memory almost reached him. Edmund's left hand tightened on his walking stick. His eyes flicked just once to his solicitor. Richard saw it too. These documents were recovered from a private server used by Edmund Morgan and directors of Northline Urban Renewal, Richard said. They show that the decision to close Hailwick Station was not based on passenger decline or safety concerns, as publicly claimed. The engineering report was altered. The land valuation was suppressed. The station site had already been promised to a foreign development consortium before community consultation began. The room erupted. Reporters stood. Someone in the gallery gasped. "I knew it." The chairwoman struck her gavel twice, then a third time, but the sound was almost swallowed by the rising tide of voices. Emily stared at Edmund for months. Their town had been told it was sentimental, unrealistic, backward. Arthur had sat through meetings where polished consultants spoke of efficiency, while never looking at the people who would lose their jobs, Mrs. Whitby had watched foot traffic shrink because rumors alone could kill a high street. Noah had spent nights digging through old network logs, convinced something was wrong but unable to prove it. And now Richard had placed the hidden machinery of that cruelty under public light. Edmund rose slowly. "Chairwoman," he said, his voice cutting through the noise with icy control, "I must object to the introduction of stolen and unverified material." Clara stepped closer to Richard. For the first time since Emily had met her, Clara looked less like a frightened daughter of wealth and more like someone who had finally tired of being afraid. "They are verified," Clara said. "I authorized the forensic review. The metadata links directly to Morgan Capital internal accounts and to your office." Edmund looked at his niece with a disappointment so intimate it made Emily's skin crawl. "You have always mistaken panic for morality, Clara." Richard moved slightly, placing himself between Edmund's gaze and his sister. It was a small movement. Emily loved him for it. The chairwoman called for order and requested the drive be taken by the clerk. A legal advisor approached. Edmund's solicitor whispered fiercely into his ear, but Edmund did not sit. His attention moved now, deliberately, to Emily. "And I suppose we are to accept this performance as noble?" Edmund asked. A man emerging from neurological trauma, emotionally compromised by a woman who sheltered him, now attacking the company his father built with documents he cannot possibly contextualize. The warmth Richard had carried into the room seemed to meet a wall of frost. Edmund lifted a second folder. Richard went still. Emily felt it before she understood it, the subtle withdrawal in his body, the way his breathing changed, the way Clara whispered, "No," under her breath. Edmund held the folder high enough for the press to see the hospital crest. "This is the neurological assessment following Richard Morgan's accident," he said. "It notes memory disruption, emotional disorientation, impaired executive certainty, and vulnerability to attachment transfer during recovery. The words were clinical, clean, merciless. They landed in the room like instruments laid out for surgery. Emily's hands turned cold. Richard's face did not collapse. That made it worse. He stood very straight, as though all his pain had been ordered to remain private. Edmund's voice softened and somehow became more vicious. This is not a love story. This is a governance crisis. Morgan Capital cannot be placed in the hands of a man whose recent decisions may be the result of cognitive instability and emotional dependency. Vanessa looked down at the table, but not before Emily saw relief pass across her face. The chairwoman's expression tightened. Mr. Morgan, was this report disclosed to the board? My medical recovery was disclosed in summary, Richard said. Not the full report, Edmund pressed. Not the recommendation for continued observation. Not the concern that high-pressure executive decisions could be affected during the post-traumatic period. A fresh murmur rolled through the chamber. This one was different from before, less angry, more uncertain. Public sympathy was a fragile creature. It startled easily when fed the language of risk. Emily wanted to stand. She wanted to shout that a medical report was not a confession, that healing did not make a person unworthy, that Edmund had no right to turn Richard's wounds into a weapon. But she also knew how the world worked. If she moved too quickly, they would say she was emotional. If she stayed silent, they would say Edmund was right. Richard turned his head, just slightly, toward her. He did not ask for help. That was what broke her heart. He had come into this room to defend her without taking away her dignity. Now the room waited to see whether she would protect herself by stepping back from him. She could almost hear the advice others would give. Let the rich destroy one another, save your job, save your name. Do not stand too close to scandal, it stains anyone nearby. Emily thought of Platform 3 at dawn. Richard with no memory, shivering beneath Arthur's old coat. She thought of his hands learning ordinary work. She thought of the afternoon he had helped a lost child find her grandmother. Kneeling so, his expensive instincts would not frighten her. She thought of him laughing in Mrs. Whitby's kitchen with flour on his sleeve, looking more alive than any photograph she had later seen of him in a tuxedo. And she thought of herself too, not the girl tabloids called ambitious, not the woman Vanessa had sneered at. Herself, Emily Watson, station worker, daughter of a tired family, keeper of timetables and lost umbrellas, someone who knew the difference between pity and love. She stood. Arthur's hand moved as if to stop her, then dropped, he knew. Perhaps he had always known that courage once taught no longer belonged to the teacher. The chamber quieted by degrees. Emily did not look at Edmund, she looked at the board. I am not here to diagnose Richard Morgan, she said. Her voice trembled once, then steadied. I am here to tell you what I witnessed. The chairwoman studied her. Proceed, Miss Watson. Emily folded her hands in front of her, not because she was calm, but because she refused to let them see her shake. When he came to Halwick, he was frightened and injured. He did not know who he was. That is true, but he knew when someone was being unkind. He knew when work had to be done. He knew how to apologize when he made a mistake. He knew how to listen. She paused, and the room seemed to lean closer. If that report says he formed attachments during recovery, then yes, he did, to people who treated him as a person, not an asset. Richard's eyes shone, but he did not interrupt. Emily went on. I did not know his name. I did not know his wealth. I did not ask for money, shares, favors, or promises. When I learned who he was, I walked away because I thought his world would only use mine as a footnote. She swallowed. Maybe I was wrong about him, but I was not wrong about the danger of that world. Edmund's mouth tightened. Emily finally turned to him. You are proving it now. A stir moved through the gallery. Mrs. Whitby, seated near the back in her best navy coat, pressed a handkerchief to her lips. No stared at Emily with open admiration. as if she had just repaired an entire signal network with a hairpin. Vanessa rose suddenly. "This is absurd. She's romanticizing incompetence." "No," Richard said quietly. "She is telling the truth." Emily looked at him then, and in that instant the room dissolved around its edges. Their love was no longer the soft, secret thing kept between station walls, no longer hidden in shared tea and unfinished sentences. It stood exposed beneath fluorescent light, attacked by lawyers, photographed by strangers, doubted by people who believed dignity came with a postcode. Still, it stood. The chairwoman called a recess, but no one truly rested. The board withdrew behind a frosted glass door. Reporters surged toward both tables until security forced them back. Edmund remained composed, speaking in low tones to his legal team. Vanessa avoided Richard's eyes. Clara stood near her brother, white-knuckled but unbowed. Emily and Richard found themselves separated from the chaos by only a narrow aisle. "I'm sorry," he said softly. She almost smiled, though tears burned behind her eyes. "For which part? Being secretly rich, nearly ruining my station, or bringing a medical scandal to a public hearing?" His mouth curved with painful tenderness. "All of it. Then apologize later," she whispered. "Properly, with tea." For the first time that day his face warmed. Not enough to erase the fear, but enough to remind her that Daniel had never truly vanished. He had simply remembered another name. The board returned after 40 minutes. The chamber settled into the kind of silence that arrives before impact. The chairwoman read from a prepared note. Her voice was careful, institutional, wrapped in procedure. The evidence submitted by Richard and Clara would be accepted for preliminary review. The allegations regarding document alteration and redevelopment misconduct would be referred to an independent investigation. Public consultation on Hailwick Station would be reopened pending legal advice. A fragile breath of hope passed through Emily. Then the chairwoman continued. "In light of concerns raised regarding Mr. Richard Morgan's medical disclosure and capacity to exercise executive authority during an ongoing corporate crisis, this board recommends his immediate suspension from active leadership duties pending full investigation." Clara made a small sound. Richard did not move. Emily felt the hope inside her crack, not disappear, but fracture under pressure. Edmund lowered his gaze as if in solemn acceptance, but Emily saw the victory beneath it. The vote was called. One by one, hands lifted. Not all, but enough. Richard Morgan, who had walked into the room with proof, with truth, with the courage to place his broken past on the table, was suspended by the very system his family had built. When the hearing adjourned, the press exploded into motion. Questions flew like thrown glass. Richard's security team closed around him, but he reached through them and found Emily's hand. This time she did not let go. Across the aisle, Edmund spoke into his phone, his voice low but not low enough. "The suspension gives us authority. Notify Northline. The Hailwick land transfer must be executed within 48 hours. Emily's fingers tightened around Richard's. He heard it too, and as Edmund walked away beneath the flashing cameras, Emily understood with a cold, absolute clarity that the hearing had not ended the war. It had only started the countdown. The first train back to Hailwick left London before dawn. Emily sat Richard by the window, watching the city loosen its grip on the sky. Towers faded into warehouses, warehouses into fields, and then the land opened into the soft northern grey she knew by heart. Her hand was on her lap. Richard's hand was close, not holding hers at first, as if he had learned that love was not possession, that comfort should wait for permission. After a while, Emily turned her palm upward. He took it. Neither of them spoke for a long time. There were things words could not repair quickly: the board's vote, the humiliation under the cameras, Vanessa's cold smile from the back row, Edmund's false grief wrapped around a knife. Richard's suspension had not merely removed him from power. It had announced to the world that he was unstable, unreliable, compromised by love. But beside Emily on that train, Richard did not look like a fallen billionaire. He looked like the man she had once found shivering on platform 3, with rain in his hair and no name in his mouth. Only now his eyes were clear. "I should have seen him sooner," Richard said quietly. Emily looked at his reflection in the glass. "You saw him when it mattered. He's moving the land transfer in 48 hours. Once Northline signs, Halewick Station becomes a legal battlefield for years. Then we don't give him years." Richard turned to her. There it was again, that steady practicality in her voice, the kind that had once taught him how to mop a waiting room, how to read the rhythm of local commuters, how to know that Mrs. Whitby always needed help carrying flour on Tuesdays, but would never ask for it. Emily was frightened. He could see it in the stillness of her fingers, but she had never been made of soft things only. Her kindness had a spine. By the time they reached Halewick, morning had settled over the town in a pale wash of light. The station clock stood above the entrance, old and stubborn, its black hands marking time, as if time itself could be persuaded to wait. Platform 3 was damp from overnight rain. The rails shone like dark ribbons. Arthur Bell was waiting under the canopy in his navy railway coat, cap tucked under one arm. Beside him stood Noel Price, hair windblown, laptop bag slung across his shoulder, face tight with worry and an excitement he was trying hard to suppress. Mrs. Whitby was there too, holding a paper bag against her chest. "For courage," she said, pushing it into Richard's hands. He looked inside. Warm rolls, butter, 2 apple turnovers. For a second something moved across his face that Emily knew too well now. Grief for the life he had lived without such gestures. Gratitude for the life that had found him anyway. Arthur glanced toward the main road. "Morgan lawyers called 30 minutes ago. Said they're sending representatives to secure corporate-related property." Emily's jaw tightened. "This is a public railway station. Not for long if Edmund gets his way." No stepped forward. "I kept thinking about the night of the storm, Richard's accident, the signal fault, the service diversion. Something kept bothering me." Richard's attention sharpened. "What?" "There was a freight monitoring unit near the storm platform. Not one of ours. Temporary rig. Contractors used it when they were surveying the old goods line. It had a low-light lens pointed toward the north signal relay." Arthur's gaze shifted to Noah. Emily caught the look. "What?" she asked. Arthur exhaled slowly, like a man deciding whether to unlock a door he had guarded for too many years. "I didn't trust those contractors. Never did. They came in with badges, no respect for the line, no patience for procedure, kept asking which safety systems could be overridden in an emergency." Richard went still. "Who signed their access?" Arthur looked at him. "Morgan Capital Infrastructure Division." A quiet passed between them. Not accusation, not forgiveness either. Something heavier, the understanding that powerful signatures landed on ordinary desks, and ordinary people were left cleaning the wreckage. Arthur led them through the station, past the ticket office and the staff corridor, toward the old signal room at the far end. Emily had walked that route thousands of times, on winter mornings with a paper cup of tea, on summer evenings when school children left sweet wrappers on the benches, during delays, storm, Christmas travel, strikes, weddings, funerals, returns. Today, every step felt like walking through a memory that might be demolished. The official archive was wiped. No said as they entered the signal room. After the accident report, "Convenient," Richard said. "Too convenient." Arthur opened a steel cabinet beneath the relay charts. "So I kept a backup." Emily stared at him. Arthur removed a small black drive sealed in a plastic evidence pouch, though the label was handwritten in his square, old-fashioned script. "You kept footage of the night Richard was hurt?" she whispered. "I kept footage of every irregular contractor access for 3 years." Arthur's voice was gruff, but his hand trembled. "A station survives by remembering what people with briefcases prefer to forget." Richard looked at the drive as though it were a blade, a key, and a confession all at once. Noah was already setting up his laptop. If the freight unit captured the relay, and if the timestamp matches the signal failure, we can prove tampering, not negligence, not weather. Deliberate interference. Emily's heart began to pound. Outside, the station carried on in fragile normality. A commuter asked about the 912. A child laughed on the footbridge. Somewhere, Mrs. Whitby's bakery van bell jingled faintly from the street. The smallest station in England held within its old brick walls the evidence that could topple a dynasty. Arthur inserted the drive. The screen flickered. For a moment there was only static, then rain. Heavy rain slanting white across the camera view. The image was grainy but usable. Platform lights blurred in the storm. The north relay box stood near the edge of the frame, its metal casing shining wet. Noah leaned closer. Timspurs, 2243. Richard's breathing changed. Emily knew before he said anything. That was before my train was diverted, he murmured. They watched. At 2247, two figures appeared in high-visibility jackets. Their faces were partly hidden under hoods, but one looked directly toward the freight camera as he turned. The image caught enough: a jawline, a scar near the left cheek, a contractor badge swinging open. Noah froze the frame, enlarged it, sharpened. Richard's face hardened. I know him. Arthur looked at him. Edmund's private security. He was at the hearing. The second man opened the relay box. The first checked his phone, then spoke into a radio. Rain distorted the audio, but the camera had captured fragments. Noah adjusted the sound. A voice crackled through the speakers. Proceed. Emergency control requires incident confirmation. Emily felt cold move through her bones. The man at the relay reached inside. A burst of static, a spark. The signal indicator on the relay panel shifted. Then, from far beyond the camera's frame, came the long, desperate sound of a train horn. Richard closed his eyes, not for long, only a second. But when he opened them again, Emily saw the full violence of memory return. Not as broken images, not as pain without context, but as truth. I remember the lights, he said. Red, then green. Too fast. Wrong sequence, the driver shouted. I stood because I thought. He swallowed. I thought we were going to hit something. Emily reached for him, but he did not collapse into her. He stayed upright, and somehow that was worse. He had once been a man who believed control could save him from suffering. Now he stood in a little signal room in Hallowick, learning that his own blood had turned a safety system into a weapon. Arthur's voice was low. This proves the accident was engineered. Noah clicked through the next files. There's more. There was footage of the men returning 2 hours later to remove a device from the relay box. A vehicle registration partially visible beneath mud. A timestamp matching the first emergency motion. Edmund filed with Morgan Capital's Internal Crisis Committee. Then, an audio clip from the freight unit, faint but clear enough after Noah filtered it. Edmund's voice. If Richard survives, confusion works in our favor. If he doesn't, succession becomes simpler. Either way, the Halewick closure proceeds under emergency authority. Mrs. Whitby, who had come in silently with tea no one had noticed, let out a small wounded sound. Richard did not move. Emily thought rage would come first. Instead, she saw mourning, not for Edmund, not exactly, but for the last childish corner of Richard's heart that had wanted family to mean something better than inheritance and fear. Then he turned to Arthur. Can we transmit this to the regulator? Noah answered. Yes, but not from my laptop alone. If Morgan lawyers get an injunction before we send authenticated copies, they'll bury us in procedural challenges. Arthur pointed to the archival terminal. Station server has direct chain of custody logs. If Emily accesses it with staff credentials and uploads through the National Rail Safety Portal, it becomes official evidence the moment the system receives it. Everyone looked at Emily. Richard's expression changed first. No, she almost smiled. Not because it was funny, but because she had known he would say it. "No," she asked. "You could lose your job." "I'm already losing my station." Emily, the way he said her name contained all the things he could not bear. Her being dragged through more scandal, her badge revoked, her life overturned by his world again. She stepped closer to him. "You once told me you had nothing when I found you." "I did. No, you had your life, your conscience, your chance to become someone free." Her voice softened. "Halwick gave you that. Let me protect the place that protected you." Richard looked at her for a long moment, and there in the old signal room, surrounded by humming equipment and rain-streaked glass, the distance between their worlds did not vanish. It became visible, honest, crossable. He did not rescue her. He trusted her. Emily sat at the terminal. Her fingers knew the keys. She had logged delays, faults, platform changes, maintenance incidents, lost property, staffing reports. Never evidence of attempted corporate murder. Never proof that a family empire had nearly killed its own heir to seize. A town. Arthur stood by the door. No connected the drive. Richard remained behind her, close enough that she could feel him, not touching, not crowding. Simply there, the upload page opened. Emily entered her credentials. A warning appeared. Unauthorized submission of protected contractor surveillance may result in disciplinary review. She paused. For one human second, she was not brave. She was a woman with rent to pay, with uniforms in her cupboard, with a life built from careful wages and small certainties. She thought of her mother's old advice. "Keep your head down, love. People like us survive by not attracting storms." Then she looked through the signal room window. Platform 3 lay beyond the glass. She saw it as it had been the night she found Richard. Rain, confusion, a stranger on a bench with blood at his temple, and no name in the world. She saw him later, sweeping leaves badly, burning toast above Mrs. Whitby's bakery, laughing with Noah over a broken vending machine, standing under the station clock as if waiting for himself to arrive. She saw Halwick as it was. Not picturesque enough to matter to investors, not rich enough to defend itself easily, but alive. Every bench, every timetable, every elderly passenger Arthur quietly watched until they boarded safely. A place was not valuable because powerful men could sell it. It was valuable because ordinary people had trusted it with their departures and returns. Emily clicked continue. Noah whispered, "File bundle ready." Richard leaned down slightly. "Whatever happens after this, you don't face it alone." Her eyes stung, but she did not turn around. If she looked at him, she might cry, and if she cried, she might hesitate. "I know," she said, and she did. That was the miracle, not that a billionaire had loved a station worker, not that a woman from Halwick had entered the boardrooms of London and survived their polished cruelty. The miracle was simpler and harder won. Emily believed him. She selected the footage, the audio files, the chain of custody logs, Arthur's maintenance notes, enhancement report, Richard's sworn statement, drafted on the train with shaking hands, and absolute clarity. Upload initiated, a progress bar appeared, 7%. From the corridor came the sound of hurried footsteps. Arthur straightened. Noah looked up. "That's not passengers." Richard moved to the door just as voices echoed from the far end of the staff passage. "Corporate legal authority. Open the signal room." Arthur muttered something deeply uncomplimentary about corporate authority and braced his shoulder against the door. Emily kept her eyes on the screen. 22%. Richard's phone began vibrating. Clara's name flashed across it again and again. He answered, listening for less than 5 seconds before his face changed. "Edmund knows," he said. Noah's hands flew over the keyboard. "Then we need 3 minutes." A fist struck the door. Mrs. Whitby's voice rang from somewhere outside, fierce as a church bell. "You cannot barge into a working signal room," another man shouted. Arthur pushed harder against the door. 46%. Emily's pulse thundered so loudly she barely heard the rain starting again against the glass. Richard came back to her side. Emily, if they break through, let them. They'll try to blame you. Then they can spell my name correctly in the report. Despite everything, he gave a breath that was almost a laugh. It broke her heart a little. That sound, it was the Richard she loved. Not Richard Morgan of Morgan Capital, not the heir, not the scandal, not the man suspended by frightened board members. Just Richard, who had learned that fear could exist beside tenderness. 68%. The lights flickered. Noah froze. No, 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 no. Arthur looked up at the ceiling. They wouldn't cut power to an active station. Richard's voice went dark. Edmund would. Emily's hand tightened on the mouse. The terminal shifted to backup power. A small amber warning blinked at the top of the screen. Emergency battery, limited duration, 81%. The pounding at the door stopped. That silence was worse. Richard turned toward the corridor, listening. Then the station tannoy crackled and died. Outside the window, the platform lights went out one by one, falling into grey daylight and shadow. Somewhere in the building, a heavy mechanical lock slammed shut. Noah cursed under his breath. They've isolated the signal room circuit. 93%. Emily did not breathe. Richard gripped the back of her chair, not to steady her, but himself. 97. 98. For one suspended heartbeat, the whole world seemed to narrow to a thin blue bar, crossing a screen in a forgotten room of a small English station. Upload complete. Evidence received by National Rail Safety Authority. Emily let out a sound that was half sob, half laugh. Richard bent and pressed his forehead briefly to her hair. Arthur closed his eyes. Noah slapped both hands over his mouth as if afraid joy itself might make too much noise. Then the screen went black. Every light in the signal room died. The backup fan stopped. The electronic lock on the inside door clicked, then sealed with a hard metallic finality. In the sudden darkness, Emily reached for Richard's hand, but found only cold air and the edge of the desk. Richard. No answer came from beside her. From beyond the locked door, footsteps retreated down the corridor, and Emily Watson, the woman who had found a nameless man between two worlds and loved him, before the world returned to claim him, stood alone in the dark signal room of Halwick Station as the proof that could destroy Edmund Morgan disappeared into the safety authority's servers.